So, hello, good afternoon from Kew to everybody, or good morning or good evening, according to when and where you're watching. And welcome to this second day of the Botany, Trade and Empire meeting. As a reminder, the talk is being recorded, and you can find links to those recordings on the conference page. Those links are live for a month. If you've registered for the conference through Zoom, you'll also be emailed the links and they'll be live for a year. Just a few housekeeping things. So at the bottom of your screen, you'll see CC, that enables you to enable a live transcription service. You'll also see a question and answer Q&A button at the bottom if you're on Zoom rather than on our parallel YouTube feed. And there's a very simple code of conduct in the chat bar, and we warmly encourage you to ask questions throughout the talks. And then after each talk or group of talks, we'll bring those questions together and answer as many as we can. And those that we can't answer, some of those we may tackle in the panel discussions that are occurring at the end of today and tomorrow. I'd also like to thank the Wellcome Trust, the Linnean Society and the Bentham Moxon Trust, about whose support this meeting couldn't take place, and to remind you that there are also other locations where the conversation is taking place. One of those is on Twitter at hashtag Botany Trade Empire. Do take a look. It's a great opportunity to meet other people interested in this field. We've got a really varied program for you today to avoid that Zoom fatigue that can set in the even most exciting talks. So we'll be starting with the Keynote by Vinita Damodaran, and I'll introduce that in a second. At 3:15, we've got 3 short talks that focus on the materiality of the miscellaneous reports, what they actually look like, how they can be handled, and how they relate to objects in the economic botany collection that I create here at Kew. And at 4:15, we'll move on to a panel with, I think, some of the most exciting voices at the moment at that sort of intersection of the history of science and the history of collections, drawing on some of the themes that have arisen in these last 2 days. So it gives a great pleasure to introduce Vinita Damodaran, who's giving the keynote lecture today. Vinita is Professor of South Asian History at the University of Sussex, where she directs the Centre for World Environmental History. And there's a common thread to her work, or several threads, around developing work on the history of natural history collections in the British Empire, building bridges across India and the UK. This is a very common feature to all of her projects, digitally repatriating collections to new audiences and creating new networks. And she said, we're really grateful at Kew to have had a lot of interaction with Vinita over the last decade, perhaps most importantly on the Joseph Hooker Correspondence Project. You can find on our website a really major transcription project that's making these archives freely available to the world. And I've also remember with great pleasure some of these networking meetings down in Sussex, and those ideas that were expressed at those meetings have been quite influential on how we've been thinking about how to research and how to use the economic botany collection today. So Vinita, I'm going to hand over to you to talk about decolonizing the natural history collections of empire. Thank you very much.
Well, thank you very much, Mark, for inviting me. I will proceed by sharing my screen. It's a pleasure to be in Kew, though virtually. Okay. So I'm a member of the Center for World, I'm the director of the Center for World Environmental History at the University of Sussex. And I'll be primarily talking about today the project that I've been engaged in for a long time, which Mark very kindly referred to, which is the Indian plant collections project. It's in this context that I want to talk about the decolonial exercise that CWEH has been, or the Center for World Environmental History has been engaged in. So the British intellectual engagement with the environments of empire, primarily India, Africa, and the Caribbean, over 200 years involved the use of colonies for environmental experimentation. South Asia, Africa, and Australia in particular became giant open-air laboratories for scientists, attempting to understand, investigate, and manipulate a world of new peoples, species, environments, and diseases. These encounters and interventions had permanent and sometimes adverse, sometimes beneficial consequences on colonized people and their environments. The valuable and extensive documentation of environmental change, indigenous knowledge systems, and practices of natural resource use laid the groundwork for much modern environmental thinking, especially in the tropics. As our research in CWH showed, the continents of India and Africa, which came under colonial rule, thus provided much of the context for these debates on humans and nature, and India in particular became a template for other parts of the empire. The unprecedented transformation of the landscapes and environments of the world brought about by the British Empire occurred as a result, of course, of a physical and biological, occurred as part of physical and biological consequence of economic globalization and territorial expansion. The resulting ecological reshaping was closely documented, and it remains traceable in numerous papers and archives, compiled both by private individuals and by colonial bureaucracies, naturalists, travelers, and scientific services. Some of the documents and papers are often studied in isolation, but they're only beginning to be recently researched for the network of socio-economic, literary, artistic, and ecological information they contain. When studied in association, such material amounts to a modern doomsday book, an account of the impact of European globalizing forces on the environment, especially in the tropics. As we also know that, we're not just talking about documentary archives here, we're also talking about herbarium specimens. And by 1898, for example, Kew had over 3.3 million specimens. So how does such a colonial archive lend itself for assessment and result in leading to a sort of new emancipatory future? So how do we revisit and rethink the archive in the present? That was one of the key questions that we had. So the way in which I'll proceed with this talk is to outline the richness of these collections, which I've already begun to do so, draw attention to some of the rich historiography, not to sort of reinvent the wheel. Richard Grove's Green Imperialism, he was one of the founding members of the center, and his great interest in this variety of artists, historians, naturalists who embraced the tropics with sort of euphoria. So he talks extensively about the role of the Botanic Garden and the rise of environmentalism. At the other end of the spectrum, David Arnold and the Tropics and the Traveling Gaze talks about the appropriation of these landscapes through an imperial gaze, which was a sort of omnivorous aesthetic of colonialism. You've got Richard Drayton, who spoke to us yesterday about nature's government and the ideology of improvement. And more recently, Kate Telcher's brilliant book called Palace of Palms, where she talks about the palm house as a literary and visual shorthand of the non-European, for the non-European and exotic palms. In order to sort of move on to discuss how we assess these collections, one needs to be an environmental historian, which I am, and I'm able to sort of look at these collections and draw on these collections in their particular historical context. So looking at these collections from the 17th century to the 20th century, I've drawn on some of the work, much of it secondary, on Garza de Orto and Van Rieder in the 17th century, on 19th century collecting, of course, by Joseph Hooker, and on 20th century collecting and the practices of collecting by E.K. Janaki-Ammal, who was one of the founders of the post-colonial Botanical Survey of India. In the end of my talk, I'll talk about opening up this archive in terms of public engagement, international networks, new audiences, and new knowledges through exhibitions, digital repatriation, and what CWH is actively engaged in a school project. So when we talk about these archives then, what we are talking about is how these archives were organized as an archive of knowledge in the context of empire, and look at it in the recent historiography on botany and empire. I also hope to outline the recent project in creating an inventory and digitally repatriating botanical specimens held primarily in British institutions, and to highlight efforts for cultural remediation. We examine the neglected literature and networks in imperial scientific in this imperial scientific network, which were crucial to what was a prodigious scientific renaissance in natural history and environmental understanding in the imperial context from the 17th to the 19th century, and how it brought up ideas of desiccation, colonial narratives of deforestation, soil erosion, and the collapse of civilizations, and also highlights the role of indigenous management practices in these processes, though, of course, as Richard Drayton said yesterday, we have to read against the grain. These apocalyptic narratives, in some senses, frame the current discourse on climate change. It can be argued that the current incorporation of local perspectives and indigenous perspectives in environmental processes has led to the questioning of colonial narratives about, for example, the Indian environment and the relationship of human societies with them. One important question for us then is, how do we work through this colonial legacy for the imagination of new political and environmental futures? So one very interesting point I want to say about these archives is the way in which they contain enormous detail about, say, meteorology. And one of the things that we did in our project was to examine the links between botany and climate. And here are the collections of William Roxburgh, who we all know as the great Scottish surgeon and company botanist in Madras, who writes in 1787, as he's the colonial botanist in Madras, writing about famine and general upheaval caused by a series of storms in 1787. He talks about the major loss of his papers, including those on various plant species as a result of this event. He writes, I had made and noted down many observations on its uses when large practice, sorry, I'm just going to lift this because I can't see the screen here. When in large practice in the General Hospital in Madras in 1776, 1777, 78, he lost them with all his other papers through a storm and inundation at Coringa in May 1787. So what he's referring to here is the Madras typhoon of May 1787, which was one of the series of very severe storms which occurred that year. And reports of the floods from the general letters describe a violent inundation, of which one of the other authors of a memoir states that no memory can recollect any preceding instance of such inundation. So what we are witnessing here in this record is a massive protracted El Nino La Nina event, which lasted over 10 years in this period and helps us reconstruct the meteorological history of India. So these archives are extraordinarily rich, and I'm working with Rob Allen at the Met Office, who has written a paper on Roxburgh's meteorological diary to reconstruct the climate that goes beyond the sort of instrumental record through documentary and pre-instrumental records, such as those found in Botanic Gardens and in these sort of writings of Roxburgh. So the importance of these colonial archives, I think, are very, very, very useful for us. So despite being embedded within particular colonial imaginaries, these collections have attracted much scholarship. The largest collections, as we know, are in the Natural History Museum in Kew Garden, are from India. And this aspect of the archive opens up exciting avenues for collaborative work for historians and other interdisciplinary scholars. So in some senses, when I say that this archive needs to be opened up, this archive needs to be opened up to an interdisciplinary engagement. This is an intellectually challenging archive, necessitating rigorous interrogation, and to use it properly, the historians must be aware of the conditions of its production. The cross-cultural nature of so much of the archive demands particular attention. It's also a technically challenging archive. The techniques through which the objects in economic botany collections, land use patterns, and correspondence networks can be made to speak to one another are only slowly emerging. And I hope that the Miscellaneous Reports Project is able to do this when it finally sees the light of day. As well as developing techniques of analysis, scholars have to address the need to make these kinds of records as publicly accessible as possible, especially in regions where these were taken from. Hence the objective of decolonizing these collections. This is a particularly important feature of the project that is international by its very nature. What we're going to be doing then is how do we work through this colonial legacy for the imagination of these new politics and new environmental futures? How do we understand the context of collecting and to tell the global story of plants, including information on its cultural, ritual, and medicinal uses? The gap between the vastness of the world and the smallness of the laboratory, as La Fuente and Valverde just recently said. So at our center, we've attempted to play a role in this remediation through networking quite extensively between a series of sort of institutions and to work with partners to transcribe, collate, and digitize such archives and preserve them and to make them more accessible to researchers, especially from the global south. Digitizing these vast and dispersed records housed in museums and archives around the world amounts to an enormous collective effort for archivists, holding institutions, and scientists of herbariums. So what we do is sort of forge these interdisciplinary conversations, foster interinstitutional collaboration that cross the boundaries of social sciences, humanities, and the history of science. And it is in this way, by retelling the story of Indian botany in these interdisciplinary ways, that we can sort of recuperate it from its colonial origins. And in the case of Indian plant collections, to tell a story that encompasses the tribal, indigenous, and gendered approaches to Indian botanical history. So the Center for World Environmental History was set up in 2002 as the Center for Excellence by Sussex University. Its main area of expertise is the environmental history of the tropics. It's been funded for the last 20 years by several different research grants, and we've been quite actively engaged in producing or applying for these grants. It has a regular seminar series and a network of associates, including Mark Nesbitt, I'm glad to say, right? So what we're trying to do in this is to link up, as I said, with institutions, non-academic institutions such as Kew, the British Library, the UK Met Office, the World Meteorological Organization, and the Indian institutions like the Botanical Survey of India, the Forest Research Institute, Dehradun, the National Museum of Natural History. And in some senses, we've sort of had memorandums of understanding between the University of Sussex, the British Library, and the UK Met Office, whereby institutions agree to share historical weather and climate data with a view to improving our common environmental future. So the network currently has over 90 members and makes the important case for natural history, heritage, and remediation in the context of environmental and climate change. By understanding the context of collecting, by integrating disparate collections, and by making European collections available in India through digital repatriation museum displays, it aims to play an important part in remediation. So this talk builds on this narrative and aims to highlight hidden histories in the whitewashed story of collecting from the 17th century, which included local collectors, and ends by examining the remarkable history of an Indian woman scientist, botanist, and collector, E.K. Janaki Ammal, in the 20th century. So the context then of the natural history collection, I think, are very, very important. And we sort of locate this context through the lens, as I said, of environmental history. And the agreed premise of global environmental history must deal with capitalism as the cornerstone of the global world economy. And why capitalism? Because it was the single most feature that reorganizes society. And when we talk about the relentless frontier, this omnivorous aesthetic that I talked about, we are talking about what Emanuel Wallerstein has called the capitalist world system, which extended on a global scale between 1500 and today, which had a critically important dimension in terms of resource exploitation. And this was the period when imperial expansion was becoming a characteristic of state building, when humans established new links, primarily by sea, around the entire world. And due to maritime improvements, a truly global economy emerged. Constituted of this early modernity was the collection of plants, animals, people, and voyaging. So this maximizing culture of capitalism, both early capitalism, sees, you can see it in terms of consumption patterns and resource use and the destruction of former indigenous societies and cultures. So this plant collection takes place in the context of violence. European merchants and companies found they could exploit the trade goods markets and resources of almost every land in what became an expanding commodity frontier, what the famous historian John Richards has called the unending frontier. So increased human mobility, he argues, encouraged the rapid growth of the world hunt. Commercial hunters and gatherers killed off species of wild fish, mammals, and birds, as well as trees and bushes, whose carcasses possessed value in the early modern world economy. Humans voraciously and systematically located, extracted, processed, packaged, shipped, priced, sold, and consumed wild animals in ever greater quantities over ever greater distances. So this is the narrative in which we are talking about plant collecting. And the famous historian Alfred Crosby, in his book Ecological Imperialism, argues directly in the way in which, especially for the temperate world, he calls what happens in the wake of European colonization is the creation of neo-Europes in the colonization of the Americas, Australia, and New Zealand, as a consequence of trading patterns and military actions. The introduction of horses to the Americas by Spanish conquistadors, the humble potato from the Americas to Europe in the 1580s, rabbits to Australia in the 18th century, and changes to plant ecologies. He has sort of documented brilliantly in his book. But Crosby focuses exclusively on the white settler colonies and omits any discussion of the extensive regions of the colonial tropics. And when we turn to the tropics, we see, for example, that almost every part of India and Africa was drawn into the world economy dominated by Europe between the 15th and 19th century. And the period after 1500 sees the enmeshing of the slave trade and ivory trade, capitalized by Europeans and Indian merchants, which draws Africa into global networks of trade. So tropical environmental history is still a growing field, and the focus on the political and administrative aspects of empire has included the material impacts of colonization on people's lives and cultures in terms of scholarship. Extinction, for example, and endemism in the work of Richard Grove has highlighted the way in which these early colonization in the tropics led to highly capitalized plantations, forest clearance, and import of alien animals. The extinction of the dodo in Mauritius in the mid-17th century made a great impression on colonial naturalists, for example. So the advent of colonial large continental European empires in Asia, Africa, and the Americas results in a next phase of change. The New World, for example, had given Renaissance man and discovery a global sense of transforming cultural sensibilities. But in this new phase, you get a very, very different period of collecting. So I'll map this through the histories of collecting in three different periods. So 17th century collecting, one text which is quite important for us is Van Rieder's Hortus Malabaricus. It was preceded by Garcia de Orta's Colloquies. As noted, travelers were sent to various parts of the world from the 16th century to understand indigenous practice and to collect medicinal and herbal plants. And Mendes de Garcia de Orta, the Portuguese physician who lived in Goa, compiled a detailed list of plants of India, which was translated into Latin in 1567 by Clusius. And the sort of collection that went on in this period is slightly different from the sort of collecting that goes on in the 19th century. And has been argued, far from imposing European systems of classification and perception on South Asia, the invention of printing and the collation of regional botanical knowledge actually provided an opportunity for the diffusion of indigenous South Asian methodologies of classification throughout the European world rather than vice versa. So in these early stages, you get a co-production of knowledge. For Orta, indigenous medical knowledge was very important, and even European and Arabic knowledge was deemed important. And even European and Arabic knowledge was superfluous in the face of local knowledge. So the colloquies of the drugs of India in 1563 has been described by one historian as a literary, medical, and cultural text that draws a lot on native knowledge. Similarly, if you look at Van Rieder, and this is the text we are looking at now, who pushed the boundaries of knowledge even further and took it upon himself to compose the Materia Medica for Malabar, the aesthetic qualities of Malabar forests and its plants were unsurpassed. Malabar for Van Rieder was more than just that, a garden of the world. So the Hortus Malabaricus, a 12-volume illustrated herbal, was a stupendous exercise for him and his team, which included European engravers and native informants, lasting for 25 years between 1768 and 1693, a study that is now regarded as the first survey of tropical botany in South Asia. This has led me to believe Van Rieder said that this part of India was truly and rightly the most fertile part of the whole world, and that it was largely similar to the island of Taprobana, now called Ceylon. So for Van Rieder, then, his native informants were not just Brahmin or upper caste, but were low caste servants, in this case, Irvas, toddy tappers by caste, referring to the sort of knowledge of the palm that Kate Telcher has talked about in her book. So Brahminical natural science knowledge was, as far as Van Rieder was concerned, merely academic. It thus made sense to bypass the Brahmins. For field collection, he relied on certain men who were experts in plants, who were entrusted with collecting coconuts, as you can see on that in that tenga. And I'm a Malayali. I come from that particular community, so I recognize the plant very well. So Van Rieder is relying on my community and my caste who are experts in plants, and from everywhere, as he talks, the plants with leaves, flowers, and fruit, for which they climb the highest top of trees, having generally divided them into groups of 3. I send them into the forest. 3 or 4 painters who stayed with me in a convenient place at once accurately depicted the living plants, readily bought by collectors. To these pictures, a description was added, always in my presence, quote unquote. It was Van Rieder's contact with these era collectors, the toddy tapper caste, adept both at tree climbing and plant identification, that seems to have awoken him to the wider value of the knowledge possessed by this caste. The main feature in the Hortus identifying the plants was an Irva Vaidya or physician, Itti Achudan. In Kerala, the Vaidyas were noted from the lower caste of Irvas or Thiyas in North Malabar, well versed in the medicinal qualities of plants. The botanist K.S. Manilal describes the Hortus as a treatise that gives minute details about Kerala herbs, containing the description and illustration of over 780 rare plant species. A page from the preface to the book names the Carmelite father, Johannes Matthai, Brahmin physicians Ranga Bhatt, Vinayak Bhatt, Apu Bhatt, and the Ayurvedic Irva Vaidya, Itti Achudan, as having helped in the compilation. In a recent article, Sita Reddy tells us that the 2 artists of the original drawings, Antonio Jacobs Goenkind and Marcellus Splincher, remained anonymous, while the native plant informants of the Hortus were named in the text. Some of the original drawings had local Malabari informants. Sita also hints at the complex prehistory of the Hortus, where the Carmelite Matthews drawings were printed a decade before the Hortus Malabaricus had appeared in print in the 17th century. So what is this revealing then? The complex practices of 17th century collecting are revealed when examining this text, which reveals the collaborative nature of the exercise, local native informants, European artists and engravers, and the diffusion of South Asian methodologies of plant classification in Europe that influence Linnaean systems of plant classification. Linnaeus, in particular in 1740, had adopted local classifications and establishing 240 new species. The Hortus for Richard Grove appears to remain the only faithful textual record of the accumulated Irva plant knowledge of the 17th century. So the Dutch and the Irva alliance built on botanical networks based in Leiden, the Cape, Malabar, and Batavia, and this provided the model for further botanical developments in the British and French colonial empires in the succeeding centuries. Garcia also relied a lot on native Malis for his sort of knowledge. So when we come to the 19th century, then, what we're getting is a new sort of economic agenda, the professionalization and state patronage of natural history in the intervening period, exemplified in the career of Joseph Banks between 1770 and 1810 through his financing of the Cook voyages, the activities of the naturalists on the Cook voyages that enabled new social empiricism and a scientific critique, the foundation of the system of botanic gardens. All of these allowed for interesting new ideas to develop, primarily around economic agendas, but not exclusively so. There were also ideas about climatic environmentalism, conservation and reforestation. In the Botanic Gardens in Mauritius, St. Helena, the Cape, and Calcutta, these researchers were shared through these imperial networks. And the figure that we now come to is Joseph Hooker, naturalist and botanist, who, following Darwin's visit to St. Helena in 1843, regretted the extinction of endemic plants in the island, while highlighting the role they played for mechanisms of evolution. So when we come to 19th century collections, and this is where, as Mark said, we had an Indian letters transcription project, firmly believing, as Richard Grove argued, that without understanding Hooker's correspondence on India, we would not understand the environmental history of India. His work, of course, was extremely important. His travels and letters in India between 1847 and 51 highlight the importance of India to the study of systematic botany. He aimed to understand the fundamental question in the botany of what species the plant belonged to and where does it come from. He did this, as we know, by delimiting species and classifying them according to the principles set out by him and G. Bentham. The system of botanical taxonomy was based on the principle of natural affinities and is considered as pre-Darwinian, as it did not take evolution into account. Though, of course, Darwin and his plant knowledge has come in also for criticism. As we know, that between 1851 and 52, Hooker worked on the floras of India, and his conception of species being more variable and more delimited emerged as a result of his work on the flora of India and New Zealand, which he also visited. And this has come in for some criticism in the way in which he forbade, as Richard Drayton was saying, the debate between lumpers and splitters, where local speciation Hooker regarded with some unease. And with fellow botanist Thomas Thompson in Assam, and with the help of numerous indigenous guides and collectors, the collection of plants, for example, 2,000 species of flowering plants, including many orchids, 150 ferns, and many mosses, lichens, and fungi in Sikkim, Bengal, and Assam. He discovered plants growing in higher altitudes than anybody had previously believed possible. And his drawings of over 700 plants, plus sketches of landscape, geology, and local people. So it's quite unrivaled, a brilliant plant geographer. So his work is extremely interesting and important. Now, his use of indigenous plant names, for example, is more interesting. He was more hesitant and irritated by native appellations of plant names. If you look at the prejudices of his native names, as he said, have been retained with great unwillingness. He had a dismissive attitude to native plant collectors and native artists and native nomenclature, noting his records, as I said, that native names have been retained with great unwillingness. At the same time, he romanticized the lepchas, plant collectors of Sikkim, as in 1849, where he talks of being surrounded by lepchas while he inspects the contents of his vascula. This became the subject for the tailor painting of Hooker in the Himalayas. His remarks on the people of the Digchuan bordering Tibet as being uncouth and boisterous and could be kept in order by great bullying is another case in point. He was unable to speak any Indian languages, unlike Thompson, and only a smattering of Tibetan. Though native artists carefully drew plant illustrations under J.F. Cathcart's directions, Hooker was critical of their skills. His drawings on India, however, are an outstanding resource on local ecology and landscape. For example, his drawing of Mount Everest, which I took to India as part of my exhibition. We took to it, the Q allowed us to take to India, rather. So the other thing that Hooker did was take regular measurements of temperature and other meteorological readings, which are a valuable record, like following on from Roxburgh's 18th century diary for climate change and climate in India. So Hooker's idea of climate and biogeography then were influenced by Alexander von Humboldt and Charles Darwin, the latter being a friend, as we know. Humboldt, the great German traveler and environmental philosopher, had in the early 19th century espoused a great deal of interest in deforestation. Humboldt was able to use the system of the lake, the watershed, and the forest as a geomorphological model, much as the British and French naturalists had effectively used the oceanic island as a model for understanding physiogeographic processes. So Hooker's practices of collecting have also come into some criticism for the way in which he talks of collecting 7,000 species of plants. Susan Orlean in The Orchid Thief highlights a letter written to his father, William Hooker, from Assam in the 1840s, where he notes that the roads here are being stripped like Penang jungles. For miles, it looks as if a gale has strewed the road with rotten branches and orchidae. Falconer's men sent down 1,000 baskets the other day. The extent of colonial collecting and its impact on the environment is illustrated in this statement. But Hooker's Himalayan work has particular resonances today in a region among the few highly rich biodiversity zones in the world. A lot of the plants Hooker's collected are in IUCN's endangered list today. Current floristic estimates in India and Himalayan region can be matched against Hooker's flora, which is why repatriating some of the herbarium specimens have been asked for by the Botanical Survey of India, which is redoing the flora of India. So after Hooker's flora in 1870, it's taken us so many, over 100 years or so to produce a new flora of India. So there is no all-India study of flora to match India's flora of India. And to date, though, the dominance of the Kew paradigm is challenged now by more local nomenclature, smaller herbaria, and local variations. So one way of decolonizing then the Hooker collection then is to highlight the practices and prejudices of plant collecting, which I've tried to do very briefly, to improve the functionality of the digital catalog, which we set out to do. Maybe once we're able to the miscellaneous collections being part of this wider sort of zeal for digitizing, perhaps matching collections and correspondence would be one way forward, producing high quality digital collection editions. The restrictions of the current functionality of the Kew digital catalog were mentioned in several of the meetings that we had around the Hooker collection. And looking at a much bigger project that would look at constructing a very large database integrating all types of sources in the Indian Ocean. Would be another way that we could do this. And a database that will allow us to ask specific questions. How did Britain's scientific knowledge of India develop? How did Britain's imperial expansion rest on the discipline of botany? How did colonial role affect the development of botany as a science, while at the same time enabling us to produce data sets for scientists interested in botany, diversity, and climate change. So important that we, for the Miscellaneous Reports project, that we maintain this large, grand vision. The other work that CWG did was to highlight the importance of natural history collections in India, and to try and integrate some of the collections which were disparate, notably the Warlick collection, which is now, they still haven't digitized it at the Botanical Survey of India, but 33 volumes of the Nathaniel Warlick manuscript collection were rescued where they were in danger of complete disintegration. So which brings me now to the 20th century and 20th century practices of collecting. And here we come to this remarkable figure, an era woman, Janaki Ammal, rather following on the lines of the plant collectors of Van Rieder. So this is Indian botany at the cusp of empire, the intellectual effervescence and remarkable story of this botanist working on bamboosia crosses. She was produced at the cusp of empire through the sort of interesting intersections of work that emerges as a result of sort of equivocal encounters in some senses between, and the careers of Janaki Ammal, if you link it up to the careers of two other European men at this time, Jabius Haldane and Cyril Darlington. Those two are well known, but G.K. Janaki Ammal is less known. mixed race, woman of so-called lower caste origins. Their equivocal encounters and discussions on biology, eugenics, philosophy, and politics highlight the cosmopolitan nature of science in the empire, a cosmopolitanism that is surprising given the dominant racial ideas of the time, and one that was lost as narrow utilitarian perspectives of national science begin to dominate after Indian independence. So I think her life and her career, she emerges out of a Q tradition, but she's also challenging the Q tradition, is very, very important. So she was born into a Thea family of North Malabar in 1897. Her mother was a mixed race daughter of John Charles Hannington of the Madras Civil Service. She completes a PhD in Michigan in 1931, and she becomes the first woman employee of the Royal Horticultural Society, Wisley. It's quite interesting and important that we reinstate her and we recognize her as such, a story that is invisible in their website. I think this is something that calls for us to take note of. Here are her letters to Darlington. She's a very, very active scientist. She works primarily later on after 1948 in India, but in the 30s, she's constantly communicating with Cyril Darlington. She works in the Sugarcane Breeding Institute in Coimbatore, where she devotes herself to genetic studies, contributing to the breeding of sugarcane. But every time she tries to publish in Nature, she's damned by faint praise, both by Cyril Darlington, who she's co-working with. She edits the Chromosome Atlas of Cultivated Plants with him, and by the head of the Sugarcane Breeding Institute, a Brahmin by name of Venkatraman. And both of them damn her with faint praise. And so she's finding it extremely difficult as a woman to rise in the botanical hierarchy. Though her work was excellent, she was an original thinker doing epochal work on intergeneric hybrids, such as Saccharum zea, Saccharum eranthia, Saccharum imperata, and Saccharum sorghum. Her pioneering work was in the cytogenetics of Saccharinum officinarum sugarcane, and she worked on interspecific and intergeneric hybrids involving sugarcane and bamboo. So she is a very, very interesting woman whose career I have followed as part of, as I said, the Q tradition. But here is her being challenged. She faces several hurdles from both the male scientific establishment in India and in Britain, and her practices of collecting, which result in challenging some of the Q paradigms. She's very much interested in phytogeography and local species. She's disappointed when she doesn't get to be, that's her Magnolia cobus in RHS. She's extremely disappointed when she doesn't get a position as the first director of the Botanical Survey of India. And the reason being that the Q tradition replaces her, and Janaki Ammal is terribly, terribly upset. She of course went on to then manage the Central Botanical Laboratory in Lucknow. She leads the reorganization of the Botanical Survey in India in 1950. She argues very, very clearly that the way in which the impact of Q on her career was towards the end quite negative, and she's very upset when Shantapu replaces her as the first director of Q, a Jesuit priest, someone who is in the Q tradition. So her career and her life, I think, are extremely interesting and important, both in terms of decolonizing the archive and telling and decentering the sort of privileged, heroic male explorer vision that you get if you look at the explorations of, say, Hooker in the Himalayas, going to places where no one had ever been. So reinserting Janaki Ammal in the narrative, I think, destabilizes the story that the archive was trying to tell. And this is what I mean by saying that we need to revisit the archive, to rethink the archive in the present. So what I'll finally do for the last 5 minutes is just to look at the way in which we took this story to Calcutta and the way in which we opened it up through this wonderful exhibition curated by Q and Joseph Hooker in 2000. In 2016, we took this already curated exhibition to India, to the Botanical Survey. This is rather colonial space, the BSI Gallery, Botanical Survey of India Gallery of the Indian Museum. And this exhibition is still available, and it's now moved around to 3 destinations in India. It's in Delhi, it's on permanent exhibition in 2 places, in Noida and in Calcutta, so you can go and see it. This is mainly the Q exhibition, and that's been inaugurated. You can see Gina Fuller-Love with Q, with the Secretary of the Ministry of Climate Change, Environment and Forests. So there was this was a completely empty space which we took over when we took this. So this was, in terms of public engagement, new knowledges and new audiences. To walk into the Q exhibition, you had to go through the Janaki Ammal exhibition that was co-created with the BSI with CWH. She was, as I said, one of the early directors of the Botanical Survey, and which was established in the 1890s in the post-colonial India. And she, again, was quite neglected, not just in Britain, but she'd been extremely neglected also in India. So there was a great euphoria around the meeting. You can see some of us here. And we also took the collections and engaged the collections, and this is where the narrative changes even more, where the attempt was also to decolonize the Botanical Survey of India, which hitherto had as Mark was just saying, when we talk about neocolonialism, the way in which many of these traditions have been inherited in the colonies by these institutions, which are very bureaucratic and didn't open up their collections to anybody except the scientists. And by opening up these collections and engaging with local school children, forcing these scientists to engage with local school children, opened up the archive even more and made it an excellent source for co-creating knowledge in the locality. And here are school children at the exhibition. We've extended the school project to provincial schools through information leaflets in English and Bengali. More recently, we've started the Mangrove School Project, bringing school children from the Sundarbans to the Botanic Garden. So the decolonial exercise is not just about context of collecting, reopening the archive, retelling the story in a different way, but it's also about engaging and with uncertainty, with bringing school children to dialogue with experts. And this current project aims to bring children who've just been affected by cyclones and tsunamis, cyclones and COVID in the Sundarbans. And this is a painting by a 16-year-old child who is very, very keen to take his understanding of the Sundarbans landscape, this deltaic landscape, which is rapidly disappearing under climate change, to bring this knowledge back to these experts who are sitting in their ivory towers. So this co-creation of knowledge is something that we are now engaged in as part of our renewed school project, for which we just got funding for. In terms of the herbarium specimens, this is something that we did with NHM, where thousands of Indian plants were digitized for the first time as part of an exercise in 2017. We've endeavored to have inclusive displays on to highlight multiple traditions, especially indigenous traditions and sacred groves, a wider public engagement through decolonizing the Botanical Survey of India, to help, as I said, to their new flora of India, to retell the story of Indian botany and collecting that can be retold as one emerging from its colonial origins, but moving on to encompass the tribal, indigenous, and gendered approaches to Indian botanical history. So the last slide I have is this restoration of Roxburgh House and Herbarium, a colonial heritage. You can see how dilapidated it is. It's sort of, but Maria was showing us those images of files. This is something that you might want to take over. The modern apparatus of BSI, which is housed in a cement and concrete building, seemingly rejects this colonial heritage. We are trying to recuperate it for a public engagement project, which will bring scientists, interdisciplinary scholars, and universities and school children into a space, hopefully with funding, to recuperate and recolonize the space for a sort of emancipatory future. So I'll stop there. Sorry. Yeah.
So thank you very much, Vinita, for a marvelously wide-ranging and space and time and disciplines talk. I really enjoyed that. I can see that our audience, which currently numbers somewhere about 450 people, also really enjoyed it. And I hope you'll be willing to answer some questions, because questions
Yes.
have been coming in.
Yes.
And I'll start with one from Rani Prakash, who you'll know at the Natural History Museum. I think, is your centre currently involved in climate change studies? So in other words, I think Rani is asking, the climate studies you referred to, the Roxburgh records and so on, do you have a sense of where those fit in the bigger study of climate change?
So where we are led by here is, we are led by Rob Allen of the UK Met Office, Rani. Thank you for that question. And Rani herself is a very active botanist who's engaged in India and decolonizing this collection. So I welcome this question from her. So yes, so in some senses, what we did, we had we went to the WMO meeting in Mozambique some years ago, where we had Indian Ocean Rim countries participating, and we told them how important their botanical heritage was, though they were, lying in conditions which was similar to one Marie showed us. So we think that Mauritius has started rescuing some of its archives, right, for the future. So these are tiny, tiny steps that we are taking. But if you retell the story of your botanical heritage and retell it by opening up the archive in the ways in which I've suggested, you then make it available to a whole new group of people. And as David Olusoga said, 1/3 of the footfall in our museums in this country are going to be from BAME backgrounds. You can't tell an island story anymore. You have to tell it with this international sort of global vision. And that's the way in which you get countries in the Indian Ocean, for example, rim countries, to think about their archives in different ways. It's not just part of a colonial heritage which is gone. It's an amazing resource that we can think about, open up, engage with, in the way in which you've engaged with in the Palm House, for example, talking about conservation, talking about communities.
Oh, thank you. I'm going to now amalgamate two questions by David Cruikshank and Dr. Radha Krishnan, who I think are both really interested in public engagement, and perhaps public engagement as one of the roots of decolonizing. And you mentioned you showed an example from the museum space. You showed a wonderful example from schools. Do you have a sense of what might be the other avenues for reaching that wider public audience, particularly in India?
So this we are in India. It is a very, very difficult question, because public engagement, you've got the standard museums, but public engagement for institutions like the Botanical Survey of India, like the Zoological Survey of India, are still very new. These scientists do not, if you go to the Natural History Museum, any amateur naturalist can go and look at your collections, right? So and now with social media, with citizen science on the rise in India, emerging naturalists and amateur naturalists want access to these collections. And that'll co-create new knowledges, that'll allow these collections to be exposed, perhaps result in new conservation agendas. And, I was at a meeting in Mysore where these naturalists were getting extremely upset that Indian bureaucrats were not letting them access these collections, right? So this is a conversation that we need to have, both at the level of Kew and at the level of these colonial, ex-colonial institutions, why we need to open up these collections and perhaps move away from this bureaucratic mindset to engage with other ways of looking at these collections. Yes, and that is where sort of Kew perhaps comes in, and their ideas. I've brought people here, for example, Dr. Kundu, who you might remember of Fiona Ainsworth and Mark, who I brought over from India as a museum expert to talk about how you publicly engage with collections. Yeah.
Thank you. Now, Sophia, and actually it reminded me, there was a really excellent talk at the Linnean Society a few weeks ago by a ornithologist, a natural historian from India, talking about the use of iNaturalist and other apps as citizen science tools with really concrete and excellent results. And there's a possibility to integrate historical material into some of those citizen science tools. Yeah. That's something to talk about later. Sophia Joachim asks, I think, interesting question. You mentioned that early collectors worked with local Indians. Is there any evidence that local populations had traditions of collecting, by which I think she means collecting physical specimens, before the arrival of Europeans?
So the sort of dried herbarium specimens that the Europeans were engaged in was not part of that tradition. So if you look at Mughal miniature painting and so on, so it's a very different way of conceptualizing the landscape, and the way in which the Europeans conceptualized the sort of perspectival view of European landscape painting and the gaze was very, very different from earlier periods. So while your indigenous plant knowledge was meticulously researched and understood in terms of, say, my community, which wrote on palm leaf manuscripts and had an excellent knowledge of plant medicinal plants and their values. I mean, my mother remembers an aunt of hers. We're talking about the early part of 1900. Curing herself of snake bite. I don't know how far this is true, but using a medicinal plant. My mother herself had smallpox at the age of 13, where she was supposed to drink some indigenous herbal medicines. So plant knowledge was, that's why you get the Materia Medica of the Indian Ocean. You get Europeans traveling here from 1400, as Anna Winterbottom would say, in Madras and so on, collecting plants. So plant knowledge was and in that sense, the documentation and the drawing of them was very, very different.
Right, thank you. I think that is closely related to a pair of questions that I'm going to amalgamate from Lami Yeager and Adriana Krakian, which both highlight that we're looking at it, if you like, indigenous knowledge through a colonial lens, because those are the archives that you and I work with. But of course, there was major indigenous activities of plants long before colonization and major movements of plants around the world. And Adriana gives the example of Polynesia, but these will be important in India as well. And Lani points out that recognition of traditional knowledge could be a really good way to bring people closer to science. Is there, I suppose, should we be focusing more on make indigenous knowledge in its own right as a way to decolonize histories of botany, trade, and empire?
So I think there was a move to this binomial nomenclature to make persimmon to add persimmon to the nomenclature. And I think that those sort of things are okay. That if you take the second name and change it to the indigenous name, there's, I'm sure that most ardent botanists would not disagree, would they? So there is a move. I don't see why you can't have indigenous nomenclature being included more and more into a new plant nomenclature, which if you could, we could see it in ways in which, for hundreds of years, Native Americans have called it persimmon. So why can't we have ficus people, for example, instead of calling it religiosa,
Yeah, I think these are really...
Mark, would you be open to that? Ficus people?
I think perhaps I've been discussing this with colleagues, and we feel that the highest priority is new plant names and getting that right before starting to tackle old plant names. I think it's a pretty good consensus amongst botanists, but local names and names that reflect local places, local knowledge is the way to go. That's probably not very controversial. But I think there's a wider and perhaps more controversial question about how far you integrate indigenous knowledge. And and Western science, and how far those separate streams is a super complicated subject.
Yeah, so in that sense, I think what we're doing is, it's about, as I said in my slides, getting together getting the information on the cultural use of plants, the ritual use of plants, the soils, the ecosystems, and in terms of herbarium specimens, identifying the labels much more. So you get all the information that you need of a plant. You're not just extracting the plant as a dried specimen in terms of the violence of that encounter, but in some senses, the palm house does that, doesn't it? It recreates a top tropical illusion, as Hooker would say. Yeah. So recreating that on a digital space, or recreating that in the way in which you talk about the plant. I don't know how far, this is both a cataloging exercise and making the catalog work in a way in which people from the tropical world find it accessible. Yep. In all these multiple ways of understanding plants, what some philosophers will call the complex assemblage of a plant, yep. In terms of how it's embedded as part of a sacred grove tradition.
Yeah, I mean, I think I'll just, Johanna's posted a sort of second question, but she's really interested in the story of global movement of plants, not as an exclusively European or colonial project. And my response to that would be that the evidence for those movements often sits in colonial projects, and it is a really important part of working with those, decouple them from the colonial context. And that's something I think we're very much aware of and interested in. Would love to talk more about.
So the prehistory of plant, of the pre-colonial history of plant movements, of course, yeah. I mean, plants have been moved around the world. Just look at rice cultivation and so on. Yes, absolutely.
So we have a question from Vanessa Sellers in New York Botanic Garden. Hello, thank you for your amazing presentation. Fascinating to hear that Malabar was the source for elements of a later Linnaean plant binomial system. Are some of the local plant names published in Van Reed still used in Kerala today?
And the Chariya, some of the ritual use of plants entered the Linnaean system of classification. For Onapu, for example, flower used during Onam, Velia Onapu and Chariya Onapu, different shoe flowers there. I don't know the botanical name. Do you, Mark, for the shoe flower, which is this beautiful red luscious flower. So the ritual use of that entered the Linnaean sort of plant classification system, and it's still very much used in Kerala. But botanists themselves would be using.
But if you use local names that are recorded in the Hortus Malabaricus, would they be recognized today in Kerala?
So yeah, Tenga, for example, I showed you the Tenga. Tenga is very much Tenga.
Yeah, no, fantastic. So a few more questions. So one from a Kew colleague, Aisha Farouk, down at the Seed Bank. Yesterday we heard about some parts of the French archives, for example, were no longer open access due to the risk to national security, which shows the difficult relationships between archival organizations, decolonising and government. Have you come across a sort of pushback to access to archives in other organizations or countries that you can talk about?
So, I mean, the pushback would be the issue about about France seems to be an issue of reparations for Algeria, or reparations. I mean, I can imagine if the calculation is that the British took $45 trillion out of India, according to Utsav Patnaik, how much of botanical, what percentage of that is botany, Mark is an economic botanist. Assume that 1/10 of it is plants. Well, that's what you owe India. If we go down that road, then of course there will be an issue where you'll get the French situation, which Maurice sort of outlined. But hopefully, this is not that sort of calculation. We are opening it up in order to engage with it for emancipatory futures, which are to do with conservation, biodiversity, climate, planetary health, and that is where I think we should all be thinking, now, because this is, as I said, this is not a repository that you scoff at. This is an amazing repository. And you just have to open it up and ask the right questions. The fact that it's there is invaluable.
Yeah. Thank you. I'm going to squeeze in two more questions before our tea break. So one from Caroline Cornish is interested in how the Botanical Survey of India, this may not be a question you can answer, but I'm sure you have a view on it. To what extent the BSI will incorporate local names and other knowledge into the new flora of India? Could you say anything about that?
I think there is not, this is a question I can ask Mao and Paramjit Singh, both the outgoing director and the current director. But they are, as an exercise, in answer to your question, Caroline, for one of the meetings I had with them, I took an indigenous activist to talk about sacred groves to a conference which I had there in 2017. And introducing him to talk about sacred groves proved to be very, very difficult because he was an outsider. He didn't have doctor stamped on him. They're open to interdisciplinary conversations, but an indigenous plant activist, environmental activist, was an absolute no-no. But I persuaded them that he was totally respectable. He was talking about his plant culture. So bringing in indigenous understanding that is still far step away for organizations like the Forest Research Institute, FRI, which is still going very much into civiculture and economic forests, right? Rather than conservation, habitat preservation, and so on, right? They're only now thinking about climate change and so on. So similarly for the BSI, I think, adopting indigenous nomenclature would be a great step forward in understanding plants in terms of conservation and their ecosystem and habitat sort of environments. It's a very, very different conception, which moves away, as I said, from economic botany, economic forestry, and so on.
Yeah. And it's interesting. I think we touched a little bit on this yesterday as well, but perhaps in this shift of views, which of course we've seen it at places like Kew as well, but in fact the humanities and history have quite a major role to play in understanding why it's important to do some of these things. I'm going to wrap up with one more question about Janaki Amal, and I was really pleased that you highlighted her. And the RHS have just mentioned in the Q&A, but there is a fantastic blog online, I think by perhaps Tibi Harvey and colleagues. If you Google Janaki Amal, you can find out more about this extraordinary and fascinating story. And Sophia has asked, you sort of tantalizing, you said that Amal's practices differed from Q's. Could you expand on that a little?
So she was extremely critical when Shantapu was appointed in her place in 1950 as the director, the Jesuit priest who came from the Q tradition. And she said, she saw herself as a systematic botanist, but it was the way in which her explorations among the Kani peoples and other tribal communities. She was an ethnobotanist. She was also interested in floristic elements and the way in which floristic elements were shared between in these border regions. She was moving into the phylogeny of plants, if she would have, which I think Q is quite interested in these border areas, right? In terms of the science of plants. So I think there was a huge interest in local variation and local species. And in that sense, I'm saying she was she was probably a splitter, or she was moving into that direction of local variation and local botany, if that answers the question.
Yeah, thank you very much. There's more questions, and we may be able to answer some of those. There is a type answer option, and we'll see if we can give answers to some of those. But your talk has caused really great interest. So thank you very much for that. And there's a lot there for our panel at the end of today at 4:15 to discuss. But we'll be meeting again in 5 minutes' time at 3:15 for collection encounters. We'll be looking at where some of our collections meet up with miscellaneous reports, and we'll be looking in a lot more detail at miscellaneous reports themselves. But thank you very much, Vinita, for a fantastic talk.
Oh, thank you, Mark. for inviting me. Thank you, Rachel, for inviting me, and Caroline Cornish. Yeah.
So welcome back, everybody. It gives me a great pleasure to introduce the collection encounters section, where for the next 45 minutes or so, we'll be engaging with the material aspects of the collection. And I'll start by introducing Kim Walker, who's a PhD student at Kew and Royal Holloway, University of London. Both Kim and the following speaker, Frankie, are funded by the Techni Doctoral Training Partnership. And Kim, Frankie, and the many other humanities PhD students who are working at Kew now are a really important part of that effort that Alex Antonelli mentioned in the introductory talk yesterday about embedding humanities right in the middle of a scientific institution. So Kim's work focuses on the development of quinine as a medicine in the 19th century, using the really extensive collections of bark in the Economic Botany collection here at Kew, and of cinchona herbarium specimens at Kew as well. I'll hand over to Kim now.
Hello, I'm Kim Walker. I'm a PhD student here at Kew. I'm just doing a pre-recorded slides because my internet's not the best, but I will be around at the end live to talk with you all. So I can take any questions then. I'm just going to present a little bit about my work and what my PhD is at Kew, how I do my projects and what the miscellaneous reports do for me. So my supervisor is Mark Nesbitt at Kew in the Economic Botany department, and also Felix Driver of Royal Holloway on a Techni doctoral training partner. So my project in a nutshell, I work on anti-malarial quinine, which comes from the Andean cinchona tree. There's a picture of the tree at the top there, in between me and my colleague, and a painting of the flowers and leaves at the bottom there. So it comes from the Andes. It was discovered in the 17th century, and it became the only known effective treatment known to the West, to Europeans. And eventually, around 1860, it was taken from South America and cultivated in plantations by the British in India and by the Dutch in Indonesia. Lots of work has been done on the Andean story and lots of work has been done on the Indian story, but less has been done on what was happening about the development of quinine as a medicine in the metropole, in the centre, where in Britain. So I work on that. I particularly work on this guy on the right. His name's John Elliott Howard. He was a chemist, and he worked for a pharmaceutical manufacturers known as Howard and Sons, who are one of the biggest quinine manufacturers in Britain. He was also a consultant to Kew and to the British government on the cinchona plantations, or cinchona project. What he was doing from about 1827, when he joined Howard and Sons, until his death in 1880, was looking at trade barks. So as barks came in from South America into Britain, he was looking at these barks that had been bought by companies such as him to produce quinine, having a look at them and trying to determine which species did they come from. Is there a way to tell, which could help buyers, doctors, chemists, and also can we target a species that will be really great for you growing in the Indian plantation? So basically, what species have the highest amounts of antimalarial alkaloids? So that's what he was doing. He had an extensive collection of these barks he was collecting, and he looked at a lot of Kew's herbarium, and he grew plants himself, and he had his own archives, of course, letters, and he produced lots of books and publications. So I'm looking at these collections, and it's a co-project as well with Natalie Canales of Copenhagen University, who's at the top there on the other side of the cinchona tree, who's producing genomic data from these bark collections because of over-harvesting and because of habitat threat today. The shelves at Kew, represent a snapshot of forests that once existed across the 18th and 19th century. So she's sampling them and producing like a family tree of cinchona and trying to understand where alkaloids arise on that family tree. So I'm connecting the collections together. So the box that are in the Economic Botany, the herbarium, the archives that lie in the Library Art and Archives, and then also to other archives and to other collections of barks around the world. Some in Leiden, which represent the Dutch collecting, and some in Madrid, which represents the early Spanish collecting. So connecting them all together. So we like to say it's like remapping the objects to publications and archives, and this is because lots of these barks that were sampled and collected by Howard and others were written about in publications, in books, were swapped, were sampled. So we're looking at them closely, like an object biography way, to check the labels and how they match to what the bark looks like, and try and understand a bit more about species and how these people were practicing science to develop their ideas in the 19th century. This helps us be really accurate as far as we can do about names and origins of the bark, so that Natalie can do the best job. But it also helps us answer questions about scientific practice in the 19th century and stuff like what species were being experimented on, and what species were important to people at the time, amongst other questions. But that's just an example. So at Kew, there's lots of archives. They actually have John Eliot Howard's letter archive, his personal archives. But they also have, because Kew was central to the project, to the Kew Cinchona project, they also have extensive letters, publications, illustrations as well about this period of time and this plant. So the miscellaneous reports are in particular of interest to me because they allow a targeted search. Because cinchona is such an important economic plant, there are miscellaneous reports solely on cinchona, broken down by geographical area. They also have an author catalogue, so I can break down, so I can search for Howard's letters in there. So it shows kind of like what Kew was retaining, what things Kew thought were important to retain in these archives. And it also gives you the other side of the story. So often when you're working on a historic figure and you have their letter archives, it's letters they were receiving, but you don't have the letters they've sent out. And so you only get half the conversation. You have to extrapolate a lot of information. But these miscellaneous reports allow you to kind of see the other side of the story to be read. And this example of the letter here, in Howard's biography, after he died, written by his wife, there's a reference to some plants that he grew and sent out and became important in the plantations. And he does mention them in a book, but less is known about them. But I found references in the letters between him and Kew, both sides of the story, talking about how these trees were sent and received and what happened to them. So it's just enriching the story, and it's a really great resource to have. So that's my talk in a nutshell. Please let me know any questions you have at the very end. Thank you very much for listening. My Twitter's Kim_Wirt, so if you want to follow or chat to me about cinchona, also feel free to do that. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Kim. We're going to have a discussion at the end of the free talks, so please do post your questions to Kim into the Q&A bar, and we'll pick them all up together at the end. But now it's a great pleasure to introduce Frankie Kubicki, who's also a Techne funded PhD student at Kew and Royal Holloway, University of London, working on paper making and our paper collections. She's worked in museums for the past decade and is also curator of special projects at the Charles Dickens Museum here in London. Over to you, Frankie.
Great. Thank you so much, Mark. It's lovely to be here, and I've really enjoyed all the presentations so far. Just to get started, can everyone hear me okay?
Yes.
Perfect, that's great. And I'm just about to share my screen. Does that look all right?
Yes.
Looks good.
Wonderful. Thanks so much, everyone. So, hello, like Mark said, I am Frankie Kubicki, and I'm a PhD student also working at the collections at Kew. My PhD project looks at paper making in the 19th century and specifically the search for new paper plant fibres. Today, my short presentation will offer an example of how useful the miscellaneous reports can be to those interested in the history of manufacturing commerce. To begin with, I will offer some context for my project, including an introduction to the very wonderful Economic Botany collection at Kew and a potted history of paper fibres in the 19th century. I will then move on to look at the relevance of the miscellaneous reports from my research through the figure of the paper maker and fibre enthusiast, Thomas Routledge. So my key resource or my key object source for this project is the Economic Botany collection at Kew. This collection opened to the public in 1847 and can be summarised most succinctly in the words of its first director, William Jackson Hooker, as a museum of all kinds of useful and curious vegetable products. But moving aside from this collection, I'm going to go back to the paper collection that I work on as part of the EBC shortly. I think it's really important to understand paper making in the 19th century. And so to do this, I'm just going to talk you through a little bit of the history. So paper until the mid-19th century in the UK was generally made from cotton or linen rags. From the 1840s onwards, rags become increasingly in short supply and increasingly expensive when they are available. This in turn leads to paper shortages in Europe. Paper was the foundation of business and commerce, as well as a vital resource for running an empire. And the shortage, therefore, was of national concern, involving not only paper manufacturers, but also the governments of the day. These concerns and shortages led to an invigoration for the search of other plant fibres, so that different from cotton and linen, that could make paper. Kew worked with manufacturers and governments to source and evaluate these new materials for paper production. And raw materials and paper specimens from these investigations still exist in the Economic Botany collection today. So moving on to those paper collections, a brief overview is to say that the collection includes over 500 paper specimens, including raw materials, paper pulp, and finished products. Geographical origins of the material are far-reaching and include Japan, China, India, and South America as just examples. Specimens include paper made from banana plants and palm leaves, rice paper, papyrus, and the paper mulberry tree. The paper collection held at Kew also includes many examples of paper used to make less than ordinary objects. These include hats, sandals, hair ornaments, umbrellas, and even a waterproof raincoat. But how, I hear you cry, is paper making and these paper objects represented in the miscellaneous report? Well, to illustrate the uses and wealth of materials located in these archives for a subject such as mine, I would like to share the story of one actor in particular. That is the papermaker Thomas Routledge. Routledge's better known legacy is of the successful introduction of esparto grass into papermaking in the UK. Often a footnote in these discussions was Routledge's interest and development of the use of bamboo in papermaking. What is less discussed is that Routledge did not limit his experiments to these fibres, but in fact discussed, trialled, and investigated many other plant fibre alternatives. We have examples of these materials and products in the Economic Botany collection, and a specimen of paper made from Jamaican lace file can be seen in the centre of your screen. Bamboo, however, would be Routledge's preoccupation throughout the 1870s and the subject of numerous letters sent to Joseph Hooker and William Thistleton Dyer at Kew. Bamboo, Routledge was convinced, would answer a need for a papermaker fibre that could create an excellent paper and be grown in British colonies, securing supply that would be significant benefit compared to relying on other countries such as Tunisia or Algeria for the materials. Routledge was evangelical about the cause, and therefore, in order to circulate the benefits and possibilities of this new fibre, he published 2 pamphlets on the subject, Bamboo considered as a paper-making material with remarks on its cultivation and treatment in 1875, and bamboo and its treatment in 1879. The material, so bamboo paper, also featured at the 1878 International Exhibition in Paris, where Routledge exhibited, and I quote here, bamboo fibre and paper made therefrom. It is vital to say that Routledge has no archives of his own, and these documents are scattered throughout a variety of locations. They offer a tantalising snippet of the story, but it's within the miscellaneous reports, however, that a wider picture becomes apparent. The archive includes numerous letters from Routledge to the directors at Kew and publications that he sent them, including this inscribed pamphlet of one of his bamboo pamphlets, which I've just skipped forward. So you can just see that on the left. It's really wonderful because it has an inscription on it. Now, the volumes of the miscellaneous reports include a magnificent edition of the Journal of Society of Arts, which you can see on the left here, which was published on Thomas Routledge's bamboo paper, as well as other articles on the topic, such as those from proprietary journals. The most significant conclusion, in my opinion, however, is the duplicates of copies of Routledge's correspondence with the India Office that was sent to Kew. In these duplicates that include printed versions of correspondence and memorandums, we see Routledge lobby for wastelands in British Burma to develop bamboo plantations and to further his experiments. And we learn that the Conservator of Forests from the Pegu Circle went to Routledge's Sunderland mill to see the manufacture of bamboo paper from bamboo that had come from Burma. Now, this was a huge revelation to me because, of course, as I said earlier, no archives of Routledge's mills exist, and there's nothing like a visitor book or anything like that. So to know that people were traveling to his mill to see bamboo paper at this point is hugely exciting. Now, aside from this kind of contextual and really amazing information, the reports also hold significant and vital contextual information on the objects at Kew, and includes vital clues to their collectors and networks and accession into the economic botany collection. An example of this is EBC 33915, a sample of bamboo paper. And unfortunately, because of the COVID pandemic, I haven't actually got a picture for you today. But aside from that, little information about this object exists in the accession record or the catalogue at Kew. In the miscellaneous reports, however, the original letter that accompanied the item survived, and we learn that the object was made by the indigenous population and even details of its price. You can see a little snippet on the screen here of a close-up on the right, which is Routledge describing the prices for you. From this short introduction to the subject and the examples listed, I hope I illustrated some of the uses of these wonderful archive sources for those interested in the history of commerce and manufacture. Linking correspondence, government reports, publications, and other sources, the miscellaneous reports are an amazing resource with many stories to tell us about the subject. I'd like to thank you so much for listening to my presentation, and I'm very much looking forward to the questions afterwards.
Thank you very much, Frankie. And as one of your PhD supervisors, I'm always fascinated to hear about we're often together, in fact, looking at some of these archives, but I did, the follow-up story of where this is all leading is so interesting and so rich. So as a reminder for everyone, do put questions and answers, and we'll come back to them after the last talk by Aimée Crickmore, a conservator who specializes in the repair and stabilization of books and other archival material, as well as works of art on paper, is passionate about understanding collections materials. I think that will come through in her talk. Has been project conservator for the Miscellaneous Reports Collection for the last several years, and I'm very lucky at my office is just down the corridor from the conservation lab, and I sometimes make an excuse to go in there and see the miraculous things that happen in the world of conservation. So Aimée, over to you.
Oh, thank you. Thanks, Mark, for the introduction, and thanks to everybody who's presented so far today. It's been really wonderful. I'm just about to share my screen, so hopefully that has worked. Sorry, 1 second. Here we go. Sorry, 1 second, I'm having a bit of a technical problem. Cat. Okay. So can somebody just confirm that they can see the slide still?
Looks good, yeah. Aimée.
Great, thank you. Okay, right. Apologies for those difficulties. Right, as you've already been introduced to me, my name's Aimée. I've been working on the Miscellaneous Reports Collection since about 2018, so it's been a fair while. As a bit of context of my own background, I've been a book and paper conservator since getting my master's in the specialism in 2017. Before this, I also got a graduate diploma in the conservation of objects from the University of Lincoln. And before that, I worked for a year as a craft bookbinder at the University of Lancaster. So I'm really kind of well-rounded in terms of the archives as material objects. So as a little bit of further background as well, I've built up my practical portfolio through the years by also interning and volunteering widely in a number of different collections, such as the Victoria and Albert Museum and the London Library. So I'm really geographically based within the London area. Okay, so you might be thinking, oh, conservation, I know what that is. It's all about botanical stuff. And yes, generally, when you hear the words Q and conservation, you'll think, oh, well, conservation of botanical plants. But in this specific presentation, it refers to the preservation and stabilization of material culture and heritage. Kew supports their multifaceted collections needs with a core conservator called Jonathan Farley, ACR, and they hire in external professionals like myself for project-funded roles. As other speakers have already highlighted, one of the key responsibilities of heritage institutions is to ensure that collections materials are safeguarded for the future, and Kew also has this responsibility. Conservators themselves abide by a strict set of professional ethical guidance to ensure that treatment is documented, able to be reversed, and retains the historicity of the collections items. So, having emphasised the importance of preserving the historicity of item qualities as a key tenet of conservation, how then did we come to make some changes to some of the volume formats? Well, currently about 60 of the volumes have been altered to a disbound flat format in order to enable accessibility because of the ongoing negative impact of keeping them in a bound format. What this means is, in certain cases, like the example on the slide, the structure itself is placing preservation of the material within the volume at risk of further damage. And in that case, we need to make the evaluation about how we can best preserve the material within it. But in other contexts, it's not so clear. Should an item be disbound, or what else should happen? So what factors have influenced these decisions during the course of the project? And that's something that I'm going to touch on now. So within the miscellaneous reports, one of the key issues is the inconsistency of paper quality and paper fibers which were in use throughout the collection. Because the material itself is an assortment of different pamphlets, different letters, different pieces of artwork, all collected across different geographical regions and different periods of time, there's a sort of a differential in terms of what is in use. So you can see on the folio 722 example that that paper is much more discolored than the adjacent folios next to it. And the reason is because of the kind of paper pulp that is in use. So for things like that, for items which exhibit that level of deterioration, typically it's because these documents are what we call ligneous. So these papers are almost exclusively wood pulp derivatives that have been machine processed. So it's characteristic of formats which are kind of were viewed as more temporary in nature. So newspaper clippings or memos, things that are by nature were intended to be disposable somehow. So if this material was in itself in isolation, then we might arrive at different treatment options. But because you have such a unique collection of materials all adjacent in one volume, it's not always possible to store these items singly. So what do we actually know about the bindings? Well, we don't really have that much information about when they were bound or why they were bound. We can assume that they were bound because people within the institution wanted to be able to access these records more readily, and it's a convenient way of storing them in a volume. There are two companies specified throughout the whole collection. These are Ear & Spottiswoode and Jas Truscott and Sons. That's James Truscott and Sons. You can see the binder's plate on the slide here to the left. Both of these companies were members of the Worshipful Company of Stationers and Newspaper Makers, which, if you're unfamiliar with them, were basically a guild based near St. Paul's who legislated over printing in Britain since around the 16th century. So I've not done massive amounts of research on this in particular, but both of the companies had very strong ties to the guilds from the sort of 19th to the 20th century, which is consistent of the period of production of these volumes. I think that it's probably likely because these binders were producing material under the for the government, that these were kind of representative of activities for the stationery office. And a number of the reports and pamphlets in the collection actually do cite either of the companies as the printer. So when we come to the binding style, normally there are three different types that kind of you can see within the collection itself. So you've got the half-bound green calf leather with marbled sides, which you can see a picture of on the slide, half-bound green cloth, which I don't have a picture of, or full cloth green buckram covering. So that's also on the slide. From the style and construction of the volumes, I think that it would probably be accurate to say that the first example, the ones bound in calf, were the original binding style, and cloth would then later introduced into the collection when leather at the joints failed. As I've said before, in terms of appearance, they're really quite standard for the 19th and 20th century period. Features like the red leather label and stuck-on end bands are really, really characteristic of that particular era. So, as we've said, collecting and centralizing the information within the Miscellaneous Reports Collection was a high priority for the institution. But the particular flaw with these bindings has been that this was achieved using a method called oversewing. So what this means is that the oversewing style was used to sew the series of single sheets, which is what the miscellaneous reports were, all together. Now, because it's not, as you would imagine in a normal book, a series of folios, that means that it's kind of distributed tension in odd ways across the text block, which has led to a number of perforations and meant material over the years was more susceptible to tears and other form of breakage. So I just briefly wanted to mention that in terms of the entirety of the collection, we do have a small proportion of historic botanical material. Normally this material is conventionally displayed either in exicata or as specimens, but the material in the miscellaneous reports is something distinct from that. Because they were sent as specimen seeds or fibres, the botanical material in the miscellaneous reports is a bit different because it wasn't collected together to serve a design or aesthetic function, and it wasn't really compiled by a single collector. Because it wasn't fit for purpose in that way, the fragility of the botanical material has meant a lot of these specimens are some of the most heavily damaged within the collection. And in some cases, that's meant that we've had to return them to a flat specimen sheet format. So this is an example of one of the treatments that I've had to do to a botanical specimen. So here I've used a methyl cellulose adhesive and a method called spot adhesion, which distributes tension across the entirety of the specimen and means that it's a lot less likely to flake off. So in the case of there being any uncertainty about placement of a fragment, these items would be stored in a capsule mounted to the specimen page. But here you can quite clearly see there's a shadow where that piece was supposed to go, so I've attached it. This is another example of the kind of standard treatment which I have done on the collection. So a lot of the volumes contain large, bulky, oversized maps of various geographic regions. And the way that I've dealt with that is I've prepared what's called a remoistenable tissue, which I can reactivate when is appropriate. And here, basically what I've done is I've identified the tear on a light box, flipped the item over, repaired on the back, flipped it over to check if it's stable, and I'm happy with the results, so that is then fine to go back to the collection. This is another and final example of the kind of work that I've done. So here I'm calling this reunification because essentially what I've done is reattach the boards to this volume. So what you can see here is I've produced two paper hinges using Japanese tissue, which I've toned to suit the surrounding locations before they went on the book. So there's actually a small strip of Japanese tissue here as an external hinge, which is supported by the internal hinge inside the joint, which is here, which has been toned to suit the area so it's not obtrusive. This was also reinforced by strips of aerolinen which are inserted under the joint. Okay, so after that minor whirlwind tour, I just wanted to sum up and say that from the outset of this project, the aim for conservation has been to facilitate access to the material and preserve them for many years to come. I feel that conservation plays an important function in ensuring that history isn't forgotten and that records of the past are preserved. Just to reflect on the words of the Institute of Conservation, conservation enables the care and safeguarding of cultural heritage from a cherished family heirloom to a national treasure. Thanks for listening.
Thank you very much, Aimée. Can you unshare your screen now?
Yes, I will.
Brilliant.
Hopefully that's worked.
And Kim and Frankie, if you can join us. Great, thank you very much. So thank you very much, Aimée, for that talk. I think the details of how these collections hang together is really fascinating. I know we've got some questions about that. I'm going to kick off with a question for Kim, and this is a question that's come up quite often at your talks. I know, is cinchona still grown commercially today for quinine, or is it synthetically produced?
Yes, it is. Oh, let me just move. Yes, it is. Have you got me there, Mark?
Yes,
Yeah?
yes.
Oh, it said unstable internet. It is indeed grown commercially. So in the 19th century, the British in Indian plantations grew it, and the Dutch and Indonesian plantations. Today, quinine is still grown, but in plantations mainly in the Democratic Republic of Congo, to supply things like tonic water as well as medicinal quinine. I think if you it's difficult and expensive to synthetically produce. It's still easier, more cost effective to get from trees. Regarding, and just as an interesting aside, the Indian plantations still exist, but they don't produce much anymore, not for commercial use, really.
No, thank you, Kim. I think cinchona is one of those great 19th century commodities, obviously heavily implicated in empire, but has had a sort of curious afterlife since it dropped out of mainstream medical use in the 1940s. So thank you very much. So a question from Laura Briscoe, who I think might be at the Field Museum in Chicago, and this is, I think, for Aimée. Given the mixed media nature of these collections, so you showed all the plant material that was bound in, has there been much historic insect damage?
Actually, no. That probably is something to do with the fact that Kew had, well, things have changed now, but Kew had a historic pesticide program. So some of the volumes you can actually see where the volumes have been sprayed with pesticides. So that was something I had to consider in terms of PPE in order to keep myself and users safe. It's all fine now, but yeah, pesticides were used in the past, and the consequence has been that there's actually not really been any pest activity that I've found.
You're probably thinking of mercuric chloride, which is used on Kew herbarium specimens, and is a marvelous preservative as well as being a deadly poison. That's the paradox. I think with mercuric chloride, you sometimes get that kind of black shadow, don't you?
Yes, yeah.
In any of the miscellaneous reports.
Yeah, so I'd not actually really come across mercuric chloride until I actually started at Kew, and now I've become really familiar with it. But yes, no, you do sometimes see the residue of historic sprayings kind of at the edge, typically. I don't think it's the most sort of intense amount of spraying that I've ever seen, but yeah, it is definitely prevalent in the collection.
Yeah, no, thank you, Aimée. Laura reminds me she's now at New York Botanical Garden, where of course we have zoomed relatively recently. So it's a really interesting question here for Frankie from Megan. You may not know the answer to this, but I think it suggests a really interesting research avenue for you. Do you happen to know if the scarcity of rag sources for papermaking in Britain in the 1840s was related to reverberations following the Slavery Abolition Act of 1833? And if there are historical relationships between those, do you know anything about Routledge's views on abolition? You're muted, Frankie.
This is a really, really brilliant question. It's a really interesting one. So as Mark said, I don't have the full answer for you yet, Megan, but definitely it's something that probably interplays with these shortages. Now, from what I've read, there isn't anything to suggest a clear correlation between the abolition of slavery and the shortages of cotton. But what's really interesting is actually 30 years later, there is a definite relationship between the interruption of cotton production in America from the Civil War and paper supplies. So I think from that we can see that they are obviously very much interlinked. And I think I need to think a bit more about where the cotton is coming from. I think your second part of the question is brilliant, and I would absolutely love to know about Routledge's view on slavery. One of the things about Routledge is that he's very businesslike. So most of his letters are very much to do with the types of paper that he's trialing and the types of paper that he's trying to circulate. And so interestingly, a lot of his personal views doesn't really come through. And in fact, there's only ever a few polite utterances to the hookers or whoever he's writing to be polite, really. So it'd be really interesting to find out more about that.
Thank you very much, Megan and Frankie. I'm going to answer the next question from Caroline Cornish, asking, will what you, so you, Frankie and Kim, discover about cinchona and paper collections be entered onto the catalogue database, especially cross-reference to the miscellaneous reports? And I think the first thing to say is that the various cataloguing teams, not just for the miscellaneous reports, but also directors' correspondence that's already online with JSTOR Plants. The cataloguing teams have done a fantastic job already of tracking down specimens in the Economic Botany collection and very often putting the catalogue number in to cross-reference. From the other end, it's more complicated. Kew is just in the middle of procuring a new integrated cataloguing management system where the grand intention is that ultimately, perhaps by the end of a decade, all of Kew's collections, living, archival, library, scientific, will be cross-referenceable with permanent identifiers to enable that. So it's absolutely an aspiration. I think at the moment, our best job is doing this on a relatively small scale and putting the results out as we've done with the Mobile Museum project, that Caroline was a senior researcher on, as at the moment Excel spreadsheets and data files and publications, but very much with the intention that eventually this will be an all-singing, all-dancing database of the kind that Vinita referred to, that not only link all the Kew connections, but of course link them to collections elsewhere in the world. John Bibby asked, where can I find out more about Routledge? It's not even on Wikipedia. There's a job for you, Frankie. Are there obituaries? Was he famous in his time at least?
He was certainly famous within papermaking circles. So the best information about him are from papermaking trade journals, like the Papermakers Monthly Journal. And there are a series of sort of obituaries in that. There are some local sources. So he bases his last mill and his really very successful mill, Ford Mill in Sunderland. And there are kind of local history sources that talk about him, and they're the most sort of prevalent secondary sources. But that's a really wonderful point. I think I'm going to have to make him a Wikipedia after this, aren't I?
Yeah, I think that would be a fun project. So I'm going to pick up some of the interesting questions. Felix Stryber has asked one that relates, I think, to one of my questions. I think it's worth mentioning that a new PhD student you're not hearing from, because you only started a month ago, is Heather Craddock, who's co-supervised with Kate Telcher at Roehampton University on a fantastic PhD questioning the colonial history of the miscellaneous reports. And part of her job will be to look at the administrative history. So Felix is asking Aimée, do you know if similar binding and paper was used in the records of other government departments in the same period? And can you speculate on which miscellaneous reports had the heaviest use? And I will add to that a further question. Are they simply bindings of what were loose files on loose sheets, or do you have a sense of how they were assembled?
Yes, so I think I might work backwards if that's okay. So just regarding that, the way the bindings themselves were assembled was, as I understand it, the material actually arrived at Kew as loose documents and was then later bound together in terms of making things like sort of more usable and accessible and saving space and that sort of thing. I think that was the imperative there. So yes, so they would have all been individual documents, and actually we do still have a significant portion of the collection which is just sort of loose, unbound documents that are more like pamphlets. So with regards to are there other arms of government that have similar bindings? Yes, there are. I did a quick Google yesterday, I think, just to see what was around, and yeah, there's I think it was a maritime volume that I was looking at. So it was almost exactly the same as you see with the miscellaneous reports. It seems like it was a standardized sort of format. So I wouldn't be surprised to find that there are other very similar looking volumes elsewhere. I think the style was also very similar. Tapping the stationer's archives would also be hugely useful if anybody is interested in that kind of thing, because I think if you follow the money, you often find some interesting results. And I know a lot of their members will have been involved in the binding process itself. So the other question I think you had was, can I tell which volumes are or have been most used? Yes, yes. So the archives actually maintain usage statistics, so that kind of answers that need sort of from a modern perspective. But from a historic perspective, the documents themselves, before they were bound, weren't actually cleaned or anything. So basically, the ones which are kind of more clean looking or have fingerprints on them, yes, those are the ones which are more used. Some of them, when I've finally come to them, I've had to give them a bit of a preliminary clean before they can be returned, because they've not actually been looked at in quite some time.
No, thank you very much, Aimée. I can see there's actually a lot of questions about conservation. I hope if you haven't already done so, you'll be giving a talk to maybe to the ICOM Paper Conservation Group or something like that. It sounds really fascinating project. We'll see if we can squeeze one or two more in. But I have a question from Gina for Kim. Do manufacturers, it says gin manufacturers, but I think we're really thinking about tonic perhaps here, Freudian slip. It's tonic, it contains quinine. Do they come and ask for advice on quinine resources? Well, Kim, perhaps about mentioning the names of any companies, do you want to say a word about that? And you're muted.
Yes, we have had some inquiries just about interest in history about quinine, but yeah, not mentioning any names.
I mean, I think the one name we can mention, because we haven't been in touch with them, but we did use the book launch at the Nairn Society, the Bermondsey tonic water that's made with cinchona bark rather than the quinine alkaloids. In fact, I've got
Yeah, I mean, they haven't approached us, and I
bottle here, you can see the dark brown color of the liquid. So I mean, there is a really huge interest, isn't there, in sort of artisanal and diverse tonic water manufacture now.
There are, and that's what's it. We use the Bermondsey because it's such an interesting tonic, because it's brown, because they use bark, whereas other manufacturers extract quinine and just use quinine crystals, which are clear, which is why tonic water is clear. So that one is a nice one, and it tastes good because it's barky.
Thank you very much. There's some really fascinating things. I think one or two of his questions, we'll have to see if we can get into the panels. So what great question we don't have time to answer from Anna Svensson about what happens during digitization that all of you could talk for 5 minutes on, but we don't have time to do that. I will answer a question, but I think there's a lot to think about there, Anna. We'll carry on that conversation. And a very good question from Arthur Lucas about how you can find out more about what's in the miscellaneous reports. Of course, all of Rachel's work in that cataloguing is being uploaded to the Kew Archives catalogue. It's not complete yet, but it's filling out and it will be complete by the end of this month. So go to our archives catalogue online, type in turpentine, and you'll be able to find out more about that. So thank you very much, Kim, Frankie, and Aimée. Three absolutely fantastic and fascinating talks, lots more to follow up there. We're going to regather in 10 minutes time at 4:15 for the final session of the day. And that's a panel exploring these really interesting themes that have been bubbling up yesterday and today. And just for any of you who know these names, you'll understand why this can be such a good session. Chaired by Jim Endersby at University of Sussex, with Miranda Lowe from Natural History Museum, Felix Driver from Royal Holloway, Rohan Deb Roy, University of Reading, and Johanna Zetterstrom-Sharp from the Horniman Museum. And we were so pleased when they all agreed to come and talk, because we know they're going to bring really original and lively perspectives. So we'll see you all again in 10 minutes.
Hello, good afternoon. Welcome to the final session. I'm hoping my panelists are all here and all ready. If they are, I'm going to ask Felix. So let me introduce myself. Jim Endersby. I'm a professor of the history of science at the University of Sussex. I've been working with Kew in one form or another for a very long time now, more than 20 years, I realized recently. And I'm very happy to be able to introduce this final session for today. I'm going to ask my panelists each to introduce themselves and spend about 5 minutes just introducing their topics, their thoughts about this, and then leave lots of time, hopefully, for conversation between them and for questions from everybody. So, Felix, are you happy to go first? Are you ready?
Yes, sure. Can you hear me?
Take it away, Felix.
Great. Okay, thanks, Jim, and thanks to the organisers for inviting us. Fantastic conference. I've got three points. Firstly, beginning with Richard Drayton's description at the start about Kew as an archive of the modern world. And I think that's just the right way to think of it. I think it gives us a really expanded view of what being a World Heritage Site means. So these collections we've been talking about give us genuine resources for thinking in different ways about history, including, dare I say it, contested histories. I don't really know any others, by the way. My own academic work has looked at the collections of the RGS, the Royal Geographical Society, another collection with another society with a global collection. So at about time Richard was communicating with the Kew librarian, I was doing a similar thing with the RGS, making a similar case for its collections being of importance to world history, and of thinking of them from the outside in, as it were. And later on, I curated an exhibition with Larry Jones called The Hidden Histories of Exploration, where we look for stories of Indigenous presence and agency in the collections, challenging mainstream narratives obsessed with lone explorers. And if you're interested, the Royal Geographical Society has recently revived this exhibition in digital form, so you can see it on their website, just search for it. And you'll also find the book from 2009 as well. Now, I think it's fair to say that 10 years ago, it was widely assumed that these colonial era collections could certainly in the case of the RGS, could only tell one story. And I never thought that was true, and it certainly isn't true today. But equally, these stories don't tell themselves. The archives must be opened up, as they are being opened up at Kew, and they must be read and approached in new ways. And I think, as Mark Nesbitt pointed out, the collections at Kew and science collections elsewhere, as I think Miranda will say in a moment, the Natural History Museum and other science collections offer really particular opportunities for humanities scholars, as we've been hearing throughout this conference, and I would say particularly in the context of a botanic garden. So that's the first point about these collections as archives of the modern world. The second one, just to briefly say something about the project I've been concerned with at Kew for the last few years, which is the Mobile Museum project. And that's actually looking at the circulation of objects in Kew's collections. And it looked particularly at the Museum of Economic Botany. Actually, there were 4 museums, by the way, whose history was alluded to by Richard Drayton in his book all those years ago. But more recently, the history has been written by Caroline Cornish. Now, as their work shows, this museum, I think, is absolutely fundamental to Kew's role in the Age of Empire. Just as important as the herbarium, and even, dare I say it, as the Palm House. So this is the place in the museum where the raw materials and the finished products are collected and put together. The place where the colonial knowledge of plants, their properties, their uses, was distilled and organized. So you might like to think of this museum as a kind of engine for the production of value. You might even like to think of it, in the words of Karl Marx, as the hidden abode of production of a certain kind of value, if you want to. So in the Mobile Museum project, we looked at the way that the knowledge created in the museum was mobilized, quite literally, as specimens and artifacts were distributed beyond Kew to other botanic gardens, to ethnographic museums, to natural history collections, and really interestingly to schools in a program of nature study based on objects and museums in the classroom 100 years ago. this kind of circulation nationally, globally, depended on all kinds of things. It depended on Kew's networks, on infrastructure, on Kew's place within the state, but also in the mix of what made this museum really interesting were things specific to a botanic institution. And what I mean by that is a tradition of collecting through exchange, which is a long history, and the practice of collecting in multiples with specimens sent to very different institutions. And I think those issues raise some really fascinating questions for us, for example, about the idea of the duplicate specimen as it extends across plants, plant products, and the knowledge based on them. If anyone's interested in that, you can read about that project and others concerned with circulation in our book Mobile Museums, which will be available open access from UCL Press next month. The third point, if I may just squeeze one in, Jim, if I've got time, thank you, is about miscellaneous reports. And this follows on really nicely from Aimée's talk on conservation, and it's about their form. So we have 772 bound volumes and folders bearing miscellaneous titles, but about 10% of them refer to either economic plants or cultural plants, particularly those in the latter case compiled in the early 20th century, and their cultural refers to cultivation. Now, there are lots of questions that I think are raised by the organization of this archive, let alone its consequences, its contents. Where were the reports kept, for example? Caroline Cornish is convinced that they were held in the museum. I think that is quite compelling. When were they bound together? I think it's probably from the 1880s, but that is a project in itself. But it does raise questions about how Kew packaged up its own history, really, from the early days of the 1880s. And what about these words, economic plants and cultural plants? The term economic plants is widely used from the 1860s, particularly in relation to India. But the term cultural plant seems to be used in the collection as a label, more in relation to Africa and the Caribbean. Anyway, I think these terms are fascinating. The categories are very interesting, the way they mingle between the economic, the ethnographic, and the botanical. And I think one of the images Aimée showed, which was an image of the 1871 report on Japanese paper making, contained all of those things, particularly around the making of paper. And it's that mingling that makes this collection so interesting. I think I'll leave it there. Thanks.
Thank you very much, Felix. I'm going to ask people to hold questions until the panelists have each spoken. So next up is going to be Miranda Lowe from the Natural History Museum. Miranda, if I could ask you just to quickly introduce yourself and then tell us your thoughts about miscellaneous reports. Thank you. Hello, Miranda. Thank you.
I think you're muted, Miranda.
We're still not getting any sound at the moment, Miranda.
Yeah, sorry, we're having a moment of technical difficulty. I've just direct messaged Miranda, so hopefully we'll hear from her in a second. Perhaps what I might... Miranda, sorry, we can't hear anything. I'm going to just ask Rohan if he would mind stepping in and doing his talk to give Miranda a minute to sort the sound out. So apologies for the brief interruption. Rohan, are you ready to step in?
Yes, of course, Jim. Hi, hello, everybody.
Thanks, Rohan. Introduce yourself and take it away. Thank you.
Yeah, so I'm a historian of colonial South Asia, and I work on broadly on colonial science and medicine, and recently I'm more interested as well in histories of insects and entomology. In my 5 minutes, I will emphasize two distinct areas to which historians of economic botany, I suggest, might continue to provide more attention. The first relates to the question of colonized labor, and the second relates to what I call tweaking a phrase of the sociologist Arjuna Padurai, The Social Life of Botanical Things in the Colonies. Although the exploitation of plantation labor and their resistance have been studied by historians of colonialism, colonized labor as a category hasn't received adequate attention in the history of botanical knowledge production. This historiographical invisibility is incongruous with an imperial visual culture characterized by sketches and photographs that depicted the presence of colonized labor in botanical hillscapes across South Asia in the late 19th century. Resources such as the Miscellaneous Reports at Kew, I hope, will provide clues about the exchanges between what Richard Drayton calls an improving plantocracy on the one hand and colonized botanical working classes on the other. These resources might tell us more about the fundamental ways in which the embodied skills and ingenuities of colonized labor shaped economic botany. They will also help us reassert how economic botany was embedded in material and mundane histories of colonized labor, revealing patterns of wages, recruitment, training, and resistance. Another way of decentering European agency and expertise from the history of colonial economic botany is to focus on what I'm calling the social life of botanical things. This entails tracking the transformation of economically relevant plants, such as cinchonas, into economic products like the anti-malarial drug quinine. The project of social life of botanical things also entails tracking the circulation of economic botanical products beyond the usual sites, such as botanical gardens and plantations, and instead, such a focus involves making sense of the many unexpected encounters of economic botanical products, such as quinine, as they journeyed across marketplaces in the interiors of colonized landscapes. For example, a poster now under the custody of the Philatelic Museum at the General Post Office in Calcutta reads in Bengali, "Quinine is the only cure for malaria," and depicts the Hindu deity Lord Shiva distributing quinine to an emaciated South Asian victim of malarial fever. This Bengali poster contains the instruction that people can purchase quinine from local post offices. This instruction evokes the colonial context of the late 1890s and early 1900s, when the imperial state had embarked on a project of selling quinine through rural post offices across a subcontinental scale. Very likely, this poster was designed to disseminate awareness about quinine among inhabitants of Bengal. In 1961, in a film based on Rabindranath Tagore's short story Postmaster, the legendary South Asian filmmaker Satyajit Ray used this same poster to describe some of the essential features of a colonial post office in late 19th century South Asia. In 2013, my efforts to track this historic poster in Calcutta proved difficult. The image did not show up in any archival catalog anywhere, and its existence was forgotten. When I visited the General Post Office, an exceptionally helpful member of staff suggested that I should search a dark storeroom containing old, almost abandoned items. And there, on a wall hidden behind a heavy bookshelf, I quite accidentally chanced upon this poster. Tracking the social life of botanical things in the colonies reveals how economic botanical products mingled with regional language, artists, and religion. This effort in understanding the gradual cultural assimilation of economic botanical products in the colonies inspires us to journey beyond the neatly curated archives in metropolitan Europe and to tackle scattered and recalcitrant sources in the ex-colonies, including ephemera, posters, and bazaar adverts. Indeed, the post-colonial remains of economic botanical products besides colonized labor, could be starting points for new global histories of plants.
Thank you very much, Rohan. That's good. I'm seeing from the chat that Miranda is still having some sound problems. So I'm going to ask Johanna if you wouldn't mind going next to give her a little bit more time to troubleshoot. So if you'd like to introduce yourself and do your talk, and then we'll come back to Miranda. Hopefully she can figure out what the problem is. It was all working beautifully earlier, so I'm sorry we're having these gremlins, but thank you for that, Rohan. Over to you, Johanna.
Thank you, Jim. Can you hear me all right? Great. So I think I came to this conference slightly through the back door. I'm a curator at the Horniman Museum and Gardens, and we do actually have an economic botany collection or a botanical specimens collection, but it's not the collection that I work with. So I've become really interested in agriculture and agricultural development, and in particular, the imagining of agricultural landscapes by policy makers and planners in the lead up to an immediate aftermath of independence. And that was part of a project that I was working on that was looking at collections in museum across the UK that were collected between 1940 and 1970. So in the lead up to an aftermath of independence, and in particular in Africa. And one of the collections that came to the Horniman was a huge archive of letters donated in 2017 that was part of a collection relating to a British family who lived in Khartoum in Sudan from 1953 to 1959, and then Ibadan in Nigeria between 1959 and 1969, and then moved to Paris because the father in the family, Roger Brain, ended up getting a job for UNESCO and being an advisor on agricultural development programs. So Roger Brain was an agricultural scientist. He grew up in Wiltshire, and he was affiliated with the University of Khartoum, stationed in Shambat, that was an experimental research farm that was based within the Faculty of Agriculture. And he taught on this 3-year diploma in agriculture, agricultural science, and agricultural engineering, which was the main professional training for future employees of the Sudan Ministry of Agriculture. And he also led farm inspections and undertook fieldwork for the university, and in particular an organisation called the Southern Investigation Team, which was a government-led investigation team collecting data to advise on policy and economic productivity in the south of Sudan. And the team was comprised of British and Sudanese researchers based at the University of Khartoum. Now, this huge archive of letters written by Roger Brain were written to his family, so his wife, Audrey, and his parents. And he talks about these enormous battles in the garden, trying to grow roses and camellias and carrots, and he ends up with these tiny little carrots in his garden patch. He talks about balls, dinner parties, conversations with colleagues. But as I read the letters, the thing that really fascinated me was the way he wrote about agricultural landscapes that he was surveying, and how these corresponded with the photographs he took of those landscapes and also the collections of objects he made. So, for example, writing on surveying of the vast irrigation schemes in the Nile Delta, for example, the Jazeera in the north of Sudan, he tended to focus on the technology of agriculture and irrigation and on plants. So he, described aerial spraying, these huge concrete irrigation channels, fields of cotton and lubia beans. But he described an almost unoccupied landscape. So despite the significant and long-standing communities he occupied and worked that land, they're completely absent from the descriptions and also the depicting of those landscapes. But whilst in fieldwork in the south, he was doing a population census, for example, in an area in Western Equatoria called the Donatonas, as part of this Southern Development Investigation Team report. His letters take on this completely different tone. So he imagines himself as an amateur ethnographer. He spends lots of time describing people, their clothing, their houses. At the same time, he describes their cultivations as disorganized and mismanaged. And the really interesting thing is that then he goes on to describe the landscapes that these communities live in as akin to a kind of English rural utopia. So he talks about church bells, green pastures, shepherd boys minding their flocks, rose gardens. He says, it reminds me of a warm summer's evening in August, sitting outside in Wiltshire. And I was really interested in how the landscapes as imagined and seen by this agricultural scientist then reflected the census data he produced. So I looked at archives at the Sudan archives in Durham and at the British Library. So when he's writing about the South, for example, I was looking at how this kind of imagining of the landscapes there contributed to a racialized narrative of cultural fragility. So, for example, there's a real sense in the science he produces how communities could not sustain the economic growth and changing cultivation practices that were being implemented in the North, and how these would fundamentally disrupt social life. And there's also a narrative of economic and agricultural incapacity. So despite the long-term agricultural practices that communities in places like Ishoke and Moi Moi are using to work the land and to produce crops from it, they're described as not only inadequate, but really crucially destructive to this rural utopia that he describes in his letters. So I think I just wanted to focus on three things that I think are important that came out of this for me. So the first is the significance of the personal and social worlds of colonial imagining. And we tend to look to institutions, to policy, to official documents and planning. But I think it's really important to remember that colonial nostalgia and racism sits in people's homes. And in Britain, it sits in conversations in the pub. It sits in conversations perhaps with your grandma or your memories of your grandparents. For Roger Brain, that nostalgia sat in places like tea dances, in formal dinners within this very kind of close-knit community that he worked with. And so interested in how those personal social worlds then infiltrated and really influenced the sort of the science and the policy that he produced. The second thing that I'm really interested in is scientific inheritance. So when Roger Brain came out to Khartoum, he was reading books by people like J.D. Tothill or B.M. Boyens. J.D. Tothill wrote a big book on agriculture in the Sudan, but he was the former director of agriculture in Fiji. He'd worked in Uganda, and he'd been a colonial civil servant for the last 30 years. And Boyens was well established as a agricultural scientist in Khartoum since the early 1940s. And this was the context in which he grew to understand the landscape that he then worked with. It framed the questions he asked, it framed the decisions he made in terms of where to do field work, the gaps that he identified in the questions that he kind of worked with. And then the third thing that I find really interesting is, obviously, we know and the imagining of landscapes, neither the imagining of landscapes nor the production of science are neutral, but I'm really interested in how these two intersect. So how ideas of economic viability, wilderness and nostalgia impact on the process of agricultural research. And this, in the context that I was looking at Sudan, was really fundamental to the ways in which those landscapes, the future landscapes, were imagined and planned for. And that had long-term impacts, for example, on investment in technology in the South. And so it's one thing that, with this, although my research is looking at a different period to the one that's focused on by the miscellaneous collections, I think that they produce there's a sort of a context that they speak to, which then has the sort of embedded structural implications for the production of science that happens around independence, which then goes on to really impact on economic policy in the present and the inequalities that sit within that.
Thank you very much. We're going to try Miranda again. Welcome back, Miranda. Sorry you're having all these problems.
Right.
Speak to us. Can
you hear me?
Yay! Go for it. Miranda, welcome back. Thank you for sorting that out.
Brilliant.
Please introduce yourself and take it away. Thank you.
Yes, okay, I will do that. I wanted to share an image with you, which summarises what I'm about. So, can you still hear me? Good. Have to make sure at every right, so it should just show you the one image. There we go. Brilliant. Sorry about that, everybody. Yeah, so I just wanted to share with you this wonderful image that actually summarises my research and actually what I'm about in terms of my work, linking into all of the sessions that we've had so far. So I'm Miranda Lowe and I work at the Natural History Museum. My main discipline is marine biology. So I work on marine invertebrates and look after those historical collections. But what this image here summarizes in terms of my work, in terms of decolonising natural history, is that probably about 3 years ago, well, it was in 2018, I co-authored a paper which was around, well, it was entitled Nature Read as Black and White. And it was about what it would be like to decolonize natural history. I had noticed a couple of years before that this was, let's say, a re-emerging movement. And there were a number of things that I was coming across in my daily work in terms of looking after the collections of my practice, my science and curatorial work, that there were a number of cases where I think, well, actually, who has actually collected these specimens? How, in what way are we documenting that? Whose labour has been used? Are those indigenous, are there any indigenous collectors that are being acknowledged? Any Black and brown people? And what is their contribution to science as well? Those were a lot of those links, connections and stories were missing for me. So yesterday when I heard Richard Drayton, I was really interested in the letter that he found in terms of the Kew librarian way back when. I think I just started my career at the museum, actually, Richard, if you're online, when you had that communication. But what is really interesting that Richard and others have been posing a lot of these questions before, and what we have to be mindful about in having this conference today and a lot of conversations that happened in the last year, that it's not just something that is just happening at any one point in time. It is a continuous process to decolonize archives and open them up, make them more accessible. So a lot of my work has been in terms of acknowledging those Indigenous people, those Black and brown people that are instrumental in the collecting. So I should explain this image. So I found this in just a very random way. I was actually at a wikithon at the historical, I'm not going to get this right, the Institute of Historical Research, and somebody there who was doing the wikithon actually showed me this image. So it's from the, and you can see from the script below the image, it's from the New York Public Library, and it's by a French artist called Jean-Baptiste Debret, who was and went to Brazil and was illustrating, painting, and observing enslavement in Brazil, but also what was going on at the time. And I think this is really beautiful in a sense, because it's showing those Indigenous people, the collectors, collecting all sorts. And so this leads into, well, what are their names? What, you know, how are they documented, acknowledged within any particular collection across the world? And this is why I was really infused to hear about the Kew miscellaneous reports being opened up and they're being worked on. And I think there's a lot to be said about in terms of the word miscellaneous, because even, so I do a lot of oceanographic research and work in terms of the collections I predominantly look after, but there are tons of miscellaneous reports there as well that I've often read myself. And often that is the best place for where you can find a lot of the information to connect those stories. And I think some of the other speakers earlier on were giving insight into how they found various information. So not only connecting through the miscellaneous reports, but you've also got, and I do a lot of this myself, you know, you've got old card indexes as well, and a lot of things with annotations, because I'm finding that a lot of scans that I find on various archival websites are sometimes, more often than not, quite clean copies. And so I'm quite privileged in where I work, that I not only work with collections, I'm a scientist, and I'm of Bayesian heritage. So as I said earlier, I was quite excited about the letter in terms of Barbados archives from Richard's presentation yesterday, is that, you know, a lot of the things that I look at in the sectional libraries at the Natural History Museum have annotations. There are clean copies often in the general library, but most of the important information, as far as I'm concerned, is embedded in books, in sectional libraries that have letters in there that are not going to be scanned anytime soon. And so this is, you know, to give people an insight of where they should be looking. Minutes of meetings, collections database themselves. We need to decolonize those databases of where not everything should be in a notes field, which is not searchable, because therefore then it's not accessible public front end. So that's all the kind of stories that I'm trying to tease out, which gives, if we're talking about we want more diversity within our institutions and to be accessible, that those are the kind of stories we have to tell. People like myself need to see and hear and know where to access this information, see the stories about themselves, about the colonial histories, what happened in any place when. And also, I must say that not everything is around slavery. You can see in this picture here, it could be biased in what Debret was actually painting, but it shows that, you know, there were people living average everyday lives and that were collecting as well, often collecting for these other European collectors. And we have to look at how we name, how the collections were named and who was acknowledged in that data. And just one last thing before I finish, that I've been doing some work around the historical coral collections that I look after, and been delving into, and this links a little bit to Vinita's talk, I've been delving into the colonial and Indian exhibition of 1886. And I found some official documentation on archive.org. And that again does feed into economic botany. And, you know, that exhibition itself was like a massive trade fair. And it gives great insight into the people, how things were traded and where collections ended up, because I actually have a coral specimen from that trade fair. So that's how I ended up kind of looking into this work. So I'll just stop here, Jim, so that we can now time for questions.
Thank you very much, Miranda. I'm glad we got the gremlins out of the system eventually. Thank you for your patience. And thank you to everybody on the panel. There is so much in this. And I must say, one of the many things I'm thinking about this is that how often these kinds of conferences would have involved people coming to a particular place to Kew, how expensive that would have been, the carbon cost of that, the lack of equality in who could afford the time and the money to get to the conference. And it is amazing to see more, 300 people online from all over the world being able to participate in that. That is in itself, I think, an interesting change and a welcome one. Having said that, looking down the list of participants, there are so many people I wish I could have a quick coffee and a beer with or something afterwards. So there is a downside to this too, but let's enjoy the positives. Just to sort of start us off, I was thinking, listening to all that, how the most striking thing to me about these collections is the word miscellaneous itself. The lack of order is such a rich thing because you don't know what you're going to find. And the thing I've often found in archives, I'm sure everybody's had these kinds of experiences, is you get something from the stores or whatever, you call it up and you don't know what it's going to be and you don't know where it's going to take you. And I, in New Zealand, when I was doing work on archives, I found a list of a collection of miscellaneous botanical items sent by a collector in New Zealand to the Great Exhibition. And I was able to tie that up with the official catalogue, but also with Joseph Hooker's tetchy comment about the useless rubbish sent in from the colonies by people who didn't name them properly, meaning who didn't play by the Q rule and use the correct imperial names. But the things in the box included artifacts made by Maori from plant-based products, which clearly had all kinds of significances beyond the things that they were sent to Britain for. And I suppose one of the many things that I found useful in thinking about this is Starr and Grissom's work on boundary objects, the way that things remain physically stable, but as they move from hand to hand within a network and so on, they take on different meanings, different values, different significances, and so on. So I wonder if, just to kick us off, I could ask the panelists in any order, if you'd like to comment on those things about the value of the miscellaneous, about the kind of the unexpected find and where it takes you, but also about the movement of objects, both physically, but also in terms of their significance and their meaning as they take on new contexts and serve new purposes. So there's enough to keep you going for 5 minutes. Anybody like to comment on that?
Well, I can start, because it links off the back of what I was saying. We're looking into the coral collection, and then going down rabbit warren of looking at the colonial and Indian exhibition documents. And the reason why that happened, because so I'm in the intersection of science and history and historical narratives. And so the coral I was looking at was attached to a broken bottle. So I'm actually going to just add an additional label to say, be careful, it's broken. And so that coral is in the collection for its scientific purpose originally, but was bought, and this is what I haven't quite found out yet, but was bought at that trade fair. Now, I'm not sure why. Was it bought for the coral, or was it bought because of the bottle? Was the bottle whole and it had got broken since that time? So when you mentioned about it taking on a different meaning at the moment, or the meaning until I discovered it was purely scientific. But now I'm sort of thinking, well, actually, there's an additional meaning, and I want to enhance our curatorial, our collection management system with that other data. For somebody else, I think Vinita and Richard in their talks and we've all been talking about interdisciplinary research. So by adding that data, somebody else can find and do that other kind of research.
Sorry, Felix, would you like to jump in?
I'd like to take up Miranda's point. I think many times in the history of collections or the study of collections, where collections arranged for one purpose are useful and interesting for another. And you could see some of the work in science museums, natural history museums in that sort of way. I think that's what makes what's going on, say, in some of Q's work with Indigenous communities really, really interesting. On boundary objects, I mean, Jim, what's interesting to me about looking at the Kew Economic Botany Museum and the field and the discipline is it sort of undoes, I think, some assumptions in museum history, collection history, about a sort of relationship between disciplines and collections. This is a collection which really, according to the history of dominant history of collections and museums in around the place, shouldn't really exist anymore. It's both cultural and economic. It's both plants and artifacts. It's constrained by a certain way of thinking around those things, of course, and it's sitting within a botanic institution. But just the sheer, every object is a boundary object in this case, Jim. I mean, it's a boundary collection, So this is the fascination of it, the relationship between the categories, the objects, their new uses, and these finds in any documents around economic botany, including, economic botany is not the only thing going on in miscellaneous reports, but it's so profoundly influential on miscellaneous reports. We'll speak to that.
Thank you. Yeah, the joy of this is that, as you say, the objects break down the categories, and as we follow them and we appropriate them for so many different narratives, so many different frameworks to think about them in, then the walls of the museum come down. And there is something kind of, I find exciting about the digitization of collections that allows you to start, as Walter Benjamin talks about, the kind of assembling your own museum from printed images and so on. John Berger picks up on that very nicely. And I think we're all doing a bit of that, making our own museums out of the digital resources and the other kinds of things. Can I ask the other panelists if you'd like to jump in on this? And there are a couple of questions in the Q&A. Some people asking about methodologies and so on. So if you'd like to address some of those, that'd be very welcome. Rohan, would you like to jump in on that?
Yeah, so I'd like to make 3 very quick points here. The first, of course, this very interesting provocation about thinking about the miscellaneous itself to reflect on the possibilities about this haziness, this lack of clarity, and this sort of inherent sort of diversity and heterogeneity implicit in this category. And when I'm thinking about the example of the image, the poster that I could not show because of copyright reasons, but in my open access book, somewhere towards the end in chapter 5, the book is like that image is available, which I can jolly well kind of share with you at the moment, somewhere in my cupboard that lies. However, that image, which is at one level sort of speaks to, of course, sort of a quadrilateral kind of interaction between the worlds of art, bizarre art, but art nonetheless, and science and religion and the public. It's an image, it's an example of precisely that sort of interaction that the word miscellaneous perhaps hints towards. But the second point that I wanted to make, nonetheless, drawing on the other panelists and other sort of existing literature on this field is, nonetheless, while appreciating the heterogeneity and variety implicit in this category of miscellaneous, we might also reflect upon how categorizations and classifications somehow happen. For example, the distinction between botanical and ethnographic, which Johanna sort of referred to, and perhaps Felix also referred to, this kind of sort of watertight, if you like, distinction in the archive between culturally relevant plants and scientifically relevant plants. How does that border management, boundary management, and boundary making happen? Perhaps we can reflect on that. And third very quick point that I want to make is about the history of the limits of the miscellaneous. Miscellaneous doesn't mean it's open to everybody. So perhaps we can also simultaneously use this occasion to reflect on the limits of the cosmopolitan, on the miscellaneous here. In other words, what is absent? What is silent? So we can perhaps begin to think about a history of silence within this archive, drawing on what Miranda was talking about. I'll end here.
Thank you. Anyone else like to come in on that point, or any point?
I thought I could speak a bit about sort of working with an ethnography collection, because the thing that I know that I've sort of obsessively gone down a route looking at this one man, Roger Bain, who is not necessarily a significant scientist, but that's kind of part of the interest to me, is that the production of science is often done by a massive group of people that sort of work towards it. And the interesting thing at the Horniman is the fact that the reason that I came to be interested in agricultural development in Sudan was through a collection of sort of ethnographic objects that were collected in the south of Sudan. And the decisions that were made by the museum in terms of what to acquire, but also the decisions made by the family in terms of what would be interesting to our museum and what would be interesting to others. So there was a big archive of botanical specimens that the family wanted to donate to Kew, and I don't know if they ever did that, but how these collections become dispersed. And in this case, there's no way you can understand them without each other. And it's just a sort of an interesting thing, but also the way that through kind of census and survey work, the fact that collecting of objects was seen as something important was a sort of a racialized imagining of the people who were cultivating the land in the south, and some kind of notion of cultural authenticity that needed to be preserved as a result of fragility. And I was thinking yesterday about Sarah Longair's paper and she was talking about the sort of the distribution of collections from Mauritius and Seychelles, and the lack of objects at the British Museum relating to relating to people or communities living on those islands, and how that was associated with a sort of an imagined lack of authenticity or lack of cultural value because the population occupying that land was not indigenous. And it's a really kind of, and therefore it becomes a sort of a science collection that represents that history. So the way that history is represented is very much, or the archives that exist are very much embedded within the sort of the racialized imagining of place and of landscape and of people by those collectors or those people that are creating the archives in the first place. And it has this kind of long-term effect in terms of what history is present in the archive and what isn't and why.
Yeah, I can see lots of nodding there. That's some really interesting points. Caroline Cornish just posted a question in the chat, which I thought was kind of interesting. Is there anything pejorative or dismissive about the term miscellaneous? I was thinking that there is, as with terms like peripheral and marginal, there is an attempt to push things away. But I have this feeling, which I'm sure many people here share, that moving away from the center and away from the beaten track and the obvious and the familiar is one of the ways you find interesting new things to do, interesting new angles on problems, new ways to approach something. And it just made me think about something which has been on my mind. I happened to be, the reason I wasn't here earlier today, I was teaching a seminar on imperial science to some of my students. Is the process of classification inevitably always an imperialistic kind of process? Is it always about imposing one view, one structure, one way of sorting? And are there ways that we can use technologies to undo that, to provide multiple ways of searching and finding that don't necessarily rely, for example, just to take a trivial example, on the use of the Latin alphabet and the whole kind of heritage of European thought, which makes alphabetical order apparently natural. And yet, of course, there are many other alphabets and many other ways of ordering information. So just ask you, any of you who want to come in on that, is miscellaneous dismissive? Is it rich? Is taxonomy, is classification always about somebody somewhere putting their grid over other people's knowledge, other people's ideas, reining them in and shaping them and constraining them? What do people think?
I'll answer that. Yes, I agree with what you said, Jim. It has been, and this is where further discussion and there will be over the next couple of years of us looking at that a bit more. It's going to be in terms of taxonomy, it's going to be difficult. It's difficult in the general sense, the lumpers and splitters, synonymizing, all those kind of things, people are agreeing and disagreeing within science on naming of things. But there is more than one way, and well, there has been, and it's, it's all about popularization, and at one point in time, a world dominance of a particular, Linnaeus popularized that classification, and there's something that I want to go back to what Johanna said. It was she mentioned lack of cultural value. So within that Linnaean classification, there will be other indigenous peoples that think it has no respect to their culture and they're not feeling valued. And this has been highlighted in the last year of what's gone on worldwide. That's why we're having, deeper level conversations like this right now. So, and not only in terms of classification, in terms of curatorial practice as well, that's steeped in a certain kind of way that you have to do things. We have to open our minds, all of us, into different ways of thinking, learning, listening to multiple perspectives. And there is more than one way of doing things. And that's what I have been scribbling away in the background doing. Although I had my firm, when I joined the museum, and this is the way that we do things, it's the way you curate and document. But around the outside, and because of my own cultural heritage, I've been noticing other pockets of other things that kind of feed into what I'm doing. And now, hopefully I can embed that and create the change and join into these conversations with everybody. And we're more open to that too.
Felix, did you want to come in on?
Yeah, I think it links directly to what Miranda has just said. We've got a question in the chat about what I mean by reading against the grain. Thank you for the question, but I think it does link to what you've said, because certainly my project now, in lots of other projects, Miranda's, your work, when we intentionally look for agency or presence or names or evidence of those things, we can often find them if we know where to look and how to look, you know. But sometimes the most visible things in photographs are not talked about, or in images, or indeed in text. You know, I used to say, well, collection structured a certain way, you know, those things are invisible. But in fact, what we found in this experiment with the RGS collections was there was a lot more that was partially visible. You know, there was presence, but you had to, it was refracted through the collection. Perhaps it was getting around those categories, but in a digital era, things might become available in other ways. So I was really struck by this. And I do think that it's about methodology, but it's also about curatorial, all the curatorial things you talked about, Miranda, and it's about other kinds of engagement with collections. That's really, you have to look for these things. They won't pop out at you. But they are much more visible, perhaps partially visible in the shadows, but there in large quantities. And that's what makes collections like Q's and the RGS such an important resource for world history. I mean, that goes back to Richard's question.
Thank you. Anyone else like to comment? Rohan, were you were unmuted. Did you want to jump in?
Yeah, I mean, I can offer some tentative thoughts, but very quickly, because I'm sure other panelists have much more substantial to add to this. I just wanted to say it might be useful, and honestly, I make this remark from my position of ignorance, because I don't really know the history of the making of the miscellaneous collections. But is there kind of, it goes back to the question that I think Caroline asked, in terms of the making of the archive, are there documentation and reflections as to what the miscellaneous might entail? That might be useful. And secondly, what is the antonym of the opposite, the other of the word miscellaneous in the particular context? That might give us some clues as to in what precise sense the word is being used as this heterogeneous archive is being put together. That's just a suggestion. The second comment, as a historian of South Asia, somebody who's written on decolonization and is a historian of colonial science and medicine, I have to say this, and it goes back to the question on the link between your question, Jim, about classification and power, perhaps Eurocentric power. So while we need to dissect and deconstruct that kind of late 19th century, early 20th century imperial logic and order of things, we also need to be equally critical of the pre-colonial order of things with which the late 19th century imperial paradigm might have been in conversation, and the priorities and the problematic politics represented by post-colonial nationalist governments. I think that is a kind of a big project, looking at the links between plants and power across a kind of long-term 3-tier scale, combining the pre-colonial, the imperial, and the post-colonial. That is the need of the hour, because as a historian of South Asia, I see the need of critiquing imperialism and nationalism simultaneously.
That's really interesting. I was sneakily just looking up miscellaneous in the OED while you were talking. It's one of the beauties of doing these things online. Another synonym they give for it is heterogeneous, which suggests the antonym homogeneous, which makes me think of, homogenized milk. It means making everything, bland, white, European, and all the same. And miscellaneous is the opposite. So let's, fight for the miscellaneous was my reaction to that. Can I ask, I'm conscious of the time, there's a million questions here, all of which I would like to discuss, but Simon Schaffer posted a question which I thought was kind of interesting about the kind of tensions between publicly funded collections and the pressure coming from government around preserving official stories and not allowing, you know, terrible woke people to silence the empire and pull down statues and things like that. Controversial, topical stuff. Would anybody like to offer a thought about that? Whether we can, you know, resist those kinds of homogenizing impulses from on high, while preserving publicly funded collections that are open to everybody and freely open to everybody. How are you going to square that circle? Anyone like to solve that conundrum for us?
Can't solve it. Sorry, Johanna. But one thing I would say, yes, because I was partly listening to a conversation yesterday, and so I was doing two things at the same time, and listening to this conference conversation as well. The work that I do, I always say, and I stand true to it, hopefully for always, forever. But the work that I do is not about erasing any previous history. It's about reuniting an untold history or a hidden history or those narratives and putting that alongside what something currently exists. So for me, and we do a lot of this that we get told in our curatorial practice, in our work when we're doing things on the database scientifically, enhance the database. So that's what I'm doing. I'm enhancing the history. I'm not taking anything away. I'm enhancing it, adding to it, and we need to look at things holistically, a rounded view. That's what diversity is all about, multiple perspectives.
Thank you. Anyone else like to comment on that?
I just wanted to say something about it, and then also the previous conversation about ordering. And one thing that's so important to remember is the way that collections are ordered and catalogued is, or was always, about access. So it was about how do you access information or knowledge or specimens for the production of knowledge. But those systems of ordering were obviously created with an imagining of a particular person who was going to come and access those collections. So in the 19th century, that would have been a particular kind of producer of knowledge or a researcher. And the thing that is so troublesome, but also important with museums and archives, is that that same way of ordering to enable access that was developed in the 19th century is still the way that we order and organize and categorize and name our collection. So we're still producing a sort of a means of access for a 19th century researcher. And I also listened to the conversation, Miranda, yesterday, and I thought Laura made an obvious but a good point when she said, if we still think about history in the terms that we did in the 19th century, it's like disregarding nanoscience or computer science, because it's not important. So then I was thinking about the miscellaneous collections and the opportunity to reorder and rename them in a way that provides access for a different type of researcher that have different terminologies, different questions, or different ways into the collection. And I just wanted to say that is the beauty of the miscellaneous, really, because the thing about the miscellaneous is it's valuable because it has been discarded. And so those very set frameworks of the way that a collection is named and categorized, there's a freedom. So it's actually quite exciting. And I really wish in my institution we could return to the systems, our content management system, MIMSI, and the boxes that we use to, or that we are provided with to record different kinds of information about the belongings or the objects that we work with. They're not really fit for purpose for the kind of access that we need to be enabling. And that's our biggest task, is how do you use the structures that we have and work within them to create the sorts of access that has to happen in order for our collection and our museum to be relevant. So yeah, I just wanted to say that.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Further thoughts on that? If there's anything in the Q&A that people want to pick up on, or anything else that we haven't touched on that people would like to raise?
I think
Yeah, go Felix, yeah.
One thing, because it does link to public engagement through exhibitions, and it does also relate to what Miranda said about that 1886 exhibition, that it struck me quite recently, I'm ashamed to say, that many of the encyclopedias and dictionaries of economic plants that were produced in the second half of the 19th century came out of either of museums in India or in Britain, or exhibitions. That those cataloguing operations by people like Watt or Forbes Watson or Royal or several others that produce what are authoritative works came out of these trade exhibitions, as you said. And there's a relationship between them, which is really interesting. We know that museums, exhibitions, are interlinked, but I hadn't really thought enough about these authoritative tomes that came out, kind of inventories of what you could do with plants, and a kind of key to thinking about the economic uses of plants came out of those exhibitions.
It does strike me, obviously in the present context, it's hard not to think about the digital and the possibilities it ranges. And I think a lot of us are missing the material objects and looking forward to getting back to them. But I think also about the tyranny of the physical. So I've done a lot of work about herbarium practices. And when you rename a plant, you cross out one name, you physically move the specimen to another folder in another cabinet in another building maybe, and it becomes a different species. And if you don't know the kind of privileged Latinate name of it, you can't find it anymore. And one of the things that even when we get back to dealing with the physical again, which we're all sure looking forward to, starting with, physical glasses with physical alcohol in them. But, it'll be using everything we've learned about the digital will provide us with lots of different keys, lots of different ways into those collections, lots of different ways to categorize them. And as Miranda said, to enrich them with hyperlinks and extra fields and extra ways of searching and thinking about the many meanings of things can actually all be preserved because of those technological possibilities. And that will allow them to be put to different uses, to be made, different meanings to be made from them and so on, which I think opens up enormously rich possibilities for the future. As long as we can stop the government from axing the funding for places like Kew. But yeah. Rohan, did you want to have a last word?
No, I certainly don't want to have the last word, but I might just add a sentence and maybe someone wiser should have the last word. Now, I was just thinking, we are discussing quite extensively about archival possessions and the need to recategorize and reclassify, and what is not in the archive that needs to be in the archive for us to be a little more critical. So it's a kind of, if you like, we want to add on to what we know, what the archive contains. But as somebody who's written a bit about plants, and like Johanna, I always feel that I've kind of entered this conversation in the back door because I wanted to be a historian of medicine, writing about malaria. And accidentally, I think I ended up writing a lot about cinchona plants and quinine. But it seems to me, and if I'm allowed to self-reflect a little, I ask myself, in all the kind of 5 decades of annual reports of the cinchona plantation government reports that I've consulted between, say, the early 1860s to 1910s, for example, have I done myself enough justice to what it all, to the kind of voices that I have not perhaps emphasize, the voices of silence and the peripheries and margins, invisible labor, to borrow a phrase from my colleague and friend, I'm proud to say, Jenny Banham's recent work. Have I myself, so the point that I'm perhaps trying to make is that it's not necessarily a question of absence of sources. We also perhaps need to reinterpret and have the kind of will to look into the archive with the kind of care and questions which perhaps we were not asking all along.
Thank you. I'm going to leave that as the last word because I think that's great. And I don't think anyone can have the last word in this conversation. It needs to carry on and find new places to happen, in every sense. We are past the end of our time, and I noticed the number of participants is starting to drop. People are obviously getting a bit Zoom fatigued here, which I understand. I'd just like to finish by thanking the participants enormously for their time and energy and enthusiasm. It's been great listening to them. Thank you so much for the audience for coming and spending the time here. There is more to come tomorrow, as I'm sure you're all aware. I hope many of you will be back. I hope that was of interest, and I hope we'll get to do this again in other formats both low carbon and, high social interaction possibilities in the future. But for now, thank you all very much indeed, and goodbye.